Chapter 333. Mr. Chi was stunned and confused. He didn't understand why he suddenly felt a sharp pain in his right wrist when the blade was about to touch him. It was a burning pain, so clear and uncontrollable that he failed to stab through his heart. He was even more confused. There was only a narrow gap between the blade and his chest. How could Sang Sang fit the quilt in her arms? Because he was shocked and confused by these questions, he forgot to stop the runners of the Chong and local government from taking Sang Sang away. He didn't come to himself until those people walked out of Lin 47th Street. He touched his shaved head angrily, muttered some dirty words, and sat down on the stone steps in front of the old brush pen shop. Mr. Chi, please keep an eye on the things under the bed and the 2 urns in the courtyard. Don't lose them. Sang Sang left a message before she left, so he decided to sit on the stone steps until Sang Sang came back. He could eat, drink, defecate, and sleep like this. Anyway, he couldn't leave. On the first day of the 15th year of the Tianqi era, it snowed lightly in Chang'an. The snowflakes fell slowly and sparsely on the ground. Some fell on the branches, and some fell on the cracks of the stone slabs. But when the snowflakes fell on the thin shoulders under the thin clothes, they instantly turned into water stains. Sang Sang looked down at the water stains on her shoulders. She lifted the heavy quilt in her arms, which seemed to be a little strenuous. She didn't want to put the quilt at her feet because it would be dirty by the snow water. The whole Chong and local government was silent. No advisor came out to give orders, and no chief judge summoned his subordinates to ask about the case. All the officials and runners were hiding in their respective rooms. They would rather take a detour than pass through the gate of the garden if they were in urgent need. In fact, the officials didn't even allow her to enter the yamen. They asked her to stand on the stone steps in front of the mansion and wait for orders. However, a thin maidservant standing in the wind and snow in front of the solemn yamen attracted many onlookers and discussions. The people of Chang'an were the most daring. They even dared to scold the emperor and the prime minister, not to mention the Chong and local government. For a while, there were many dirty words outside the mansion, and there were even many traces of snowballs on the dark gate of the Chong and local government. The officials had no choice but to let Sang Sang enter the Chong and local government. But they still refused to question her, and only asked her to stand in front of the garden gate. The officials had no choice but to let Sang Sang enter the Chong and local government. But they still refused to question her, and only let her stand in front of the garden gate. Wang Jinglu had been watching her. Thinking of the scene where Mr. Chi pulled out a knife to commit suicide, he felt a little weird. Could it be that this little handmaiden was a hidden powerhouse? But Chi of Chi and the Chong and local government was to be taken back to the military to prevent the empire from being damaged. Chi military was forbidden to interfere in the case. Therefore, the Chi military was Chang's local government. He thought, and thought. Chi Su Shi, the Defender General of the state, had ordered to arrest the little maidservant of the old brush pen shop and bring her back to the military ministry for interrogation to find out the real relationship between her and the divine priest of light to prevent the empire from being damaged. However, harboring a fugitive belonged to the judicial category. The sacred and inviolable law of the Tang Empire prohibited the military from interfering in all judicial cases. Therefore, the military ministry wanted to ask the Chong and local government to step in and then send her to the military ministry with the charge of treason. Wang Jinglu had sent the name card and the letter written by the Defender General of the state to the Chong and local government. He only needed to wait for the prefectural magistrate to come out and say something to satisfy the requirements of the law of the Tang Empire. Then he could take Sang Sang away. However, the prefectural magistrate of Chang'an City, Shangguanyang Yu, seemed to be getting worse. The advisor looked at Wang Jinglu with a sad face and said, "His Excellency had a fever at noon yesterday and fell into a coma in the evening. He hasn't drunk any water since. 2 doctors from the Imperial Institute of Medicine came, but they couldn't do anything about it." Wang Jinglu looked at the advisor with disgust. He thought that if His Excellency wanted to pretend to be dead, not to mention the doctors from the Imperial Institute of Medicine, even the elixirs from the West Hill Divine Palace couldn't make him get up. When will the prefectural magistrate be able to take charge? Actually, in my humble opinion, if the military ministry wants to ask the little handmaiden anything, They don't have to take her to the military ministry. To be honest, no one in the Chang and local government dares to take responsibility for this. You can ask her in this garden. Harboring a fugitive. The law of the Tang Empire doesn't say that the military ministry can investigate this case. It's just a private inquiry, not an official one from the government. It's okay. Wang Jinglu waved his hand to let the advisor leave. After thinking for a moment, he slowly walked to the front of the garden and looked at the little handmaiden standing in the light snow. Looking at the snowflakes on her yellowish hair, he frowned slightly and asked, "Are you cold?" Sang Sang held the thick quilt in her arms and really didn't feel cold. She shook her head. Wang Jinglu took out a few documents from his clothes and put them on the quilt in Song Song's arms. He opened them page by page and pointed at the handwriting on them, introducing himself. "My name is Wang Jinglu. My cultivation sect is from the Dragon Tiger Mountain and is registered in the Imperial Center Administration of the Tang Empire. Now I serve in the military ministry. According to the law of the Tang Empire, I have the right to question you." The Defender General of the state Su Shi was undoubtedly the most powerful person in the Tang Empire's military. Even such a big shot had to go through the formal procedures to question a little handmaiden. It was not because of the little handmaiden's background from the academy, but because he wanted to show an attitude of respect for the law of the Tang Empire, and let the academy see this attitude clearly. Wang Jinglu had followed Su Shi to fight in the southern border for a long time, and was very clear about the old general's stubborn personality. In addition, the Tang Empire valued martial arts and the military had a special status, so he was not worried about the academy's reaction. That old man was involved in a murder case in Chang, and more than a decade ago. The West Hill Divine Palace accused him of betraying Haotian, and the whole world was searching for him. However, he lived with you in the old brush pen shop for many days. I want to ask you. Wang Jinglu was slightly startled and stopped asking because he found that Song Song's head was pressed against the thick quilt. It seemed that she had no intention of listening to his question, let alone answering it. He said with slight annoyance, "You are just a handmaiden. Don't expect your young master or even the academy to stand up for a handmaiden. I don't want to make things difficult for you, as long as you can clearly explain your relationship with that old man." Sang Sang looked up at him and said, "I can't say." Wang Jinglu was slightly surprised and asked why. Sang Sang said, "Young master warned me when I was young that I can't answer questions from strangers." Wang Jinglu did not know what to say. At this moment, a calm and dignified voice sounded in the garden. "Little girl, there are some questions that you have to answer." A yellow oiled paper umbrella appeared in the Chang and local government. There were fine snowflakes on the umbrella. The person who said this was not the Taoist under the umbrella, but an official in red beside the umbrella. Wang Jinglu frowned slightly. In the past, when he was a visiting official in the prince's mansion, he did not know much about the powerhouses in the imperial court. On that rainy night, he could not guess the identity of Master Yen Sei at all. Now that he was a member of the imperial court, he knew a lot of things, so he easily recognized the identity of these two people. The official in red was Zhuge Warren, the highest official of the Imperial Center Administration of the Tang Empire. The Taoist holding the yellow oiled paper umbrella was He Ming-chi, the disciple of the nation master Li Qingshan. The appearance of these two people at the same time was enough to represent the cultivators in the imperial court. Wang Jinglu did not expect that there would be other people in the imperial court who were interested in this thin and dark maidservant other than the solitary and respected General Su Shi. If they dared to be interested, did they not know who the owner of the old brush pen shop was? Zhuge Warren looked at Wang Jinglu and nodded slightly to greet him. He said, "I don't know what case the military ministry wants to investigate that needs to ask this woman, but we do have some urgent things to ask her." The Imperial Center Administration of the Tang Empire was an institution that managed the cultivators in the empire. It had a very close relationship with the military and the South School of Haotian Taoism. The chief Zhuge Warren had always been extremely mysterious. It was said that this official did not know how to cultivate at all. At this time, Wang Jinglu did not feel any aura from him, but he became more vigilant. An official who did not know how to cultivate was able to control so many powerful cultivators in the imperial court and the military. Apart from the power of the Tang Empire itself, This kind of person was undoubtedly a very important person. He Mingqi closed the yellow paper umbrella and looked at Wang Jinglu. He explained softly, Lord Zhuge and I went to Lin 47th Street. Only then did we know that this little handmaiden had been brought to the Chang and local government by Mr. Wang, so we came here. Wang Jinglu said, I wonder what Lord Zhuge wants to ask. Zhuge Warren said coldly, of course it's something you can't listen to. After a moment of silence, Wang Jinglu laughed at himself and slowly walked out with his hands behind his back. He said, you'd better hurry up. With a swoosh, the yellow oiled paper umbrella was opened in He Mingqi's hands again. As the umbrella's cover opened, a faintly discernible aura enveloped the garden of the Chang and local government. The sound from the outside world suddenly became faint. Sang Sang raised her head and looked at the yellow oiled paper umbrella curiously, probably thinking of her big black umbrella. He Mingqi thought that the little handmaiden was worried about something, so he smiled gently and explained, it's just soundproofing. It won't cause any harm to you. Lord Zhuge has something important to ask you. Just answer truthfully. Zhuge Warren stared at Song Song's eyes and asked in a gloomy tone, before Master Yen Sei and the Divine Priest of Light perished together, you were the only one in the world on that mountaintop. I want to ask you if the Master left anything behind. The official's tone was very cold. He Mingqi could not help but frown slightly. He was probably thinking, since younger brother Ningke is a visiting professor of the Imperial Center Administration, why are you so tough with his handmaiden? Sang Sang looked at the official and said seriously after a moment of silence, Master Yen Sei left that horse carriage for my young master. Zhuge Warren scolded with disgust and anger. You know that's not what I'm asking. Sang Sang was not frightened by the other party's expression at all. She replied very seriously, whether it's the horse carriage or anything else, even if there is, it's all left for my young master. So what does it have to do with you? Zhuge Warren took a deep breath and said coldly, however, some things are too important. Even the person involved cannot give it to others privately, because that thing is related to the future of the entire Tang Empire. He Mingqi held the yellow umbrella in silence. He disagreed with the actions of the Imperial Center Administration, but he had to admit that Lord Zhuge's words were very correct. The big tactical array of Chang and city had protected the Tang Empire for thousands of years. Its array I could not fall into the hands of a thin and dark handmaiden. Send the third chapter. Try to finish the fourth chapter around 11 o'clock. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 334. Under the tree on the mountain, the great divine priest of light gave Sang Sang an ID token and touched her head lovingly. Master Yen Sei took something out of his arms and gave it to her solemnly. Then he said a few words. Soon after, the two old men became two piles of ashes on the cliff. Sang Sang certainly would not forget those details, so she knew what the official wanted, but she could pretend not to understand. Sang Sang was not a cute little handmaiden who was good at pretending, so she could not hide it from the official's eyes. Zhuge Warren's face became more and more gloomy, as if he would burst into anger at any time. He Mingqi coughed slightly and then glanced at him. The meaning expressed in his eyes was very clear. Although the formation I was important, it was Master Yen Sei who gave it to Ning Ke, so they could not rob it. If the imperial court was really worried, they could strictly guard the old brush pen shop and wait for Ning Ke to come back. Lord Zhuge knew what he meant and said indifferently, Taoist he, I know you are the second prince's study companion, but I want to remind you that he is the second prince after all, and you really don't want to be the nation master of Tang? He Mingqi suddenly thought that Lord Zhuge was close to the empress, and many people in Chang and knew that Ning Ke and Princess Li Yu were close. Could it be that the empress did not want Ning Ke to be the nation master of Tang? He smiled bitterly and shook his head. Because Zhuge mentioned himself, he did not want to pay attention to these things, but he thought of something and could not help saying, Lord Zhuge, you'd better not forget whose little handmaiden she is. Zhuge Warren was silent for a moment, and a flash of determination flashed in his eyes. He said, this concerns the safety of the empire. I think even the academy will agree with me. Moreover, I have never disrespected Mr. 13. Will the Academy be angry by interrogating a maidservant? Then I would like to ask, is it empty talk that the Academy does not interfere in the imperial court? He looked at Sang Sang and said indifferently, you must hand over the things left by Master Yen Sei and the Divine Priest of Light. At this time Wang Jinglu returned to the garden, looked at the two and asked coldly, are you done? I want to take her back to the military ministry. He Mingqi looked at him in confusion and asked, General, what do you want to ask about this little maidservant? Wang Jinglu replied, the Divine Priest of Light and the Chong and City murder case 14 years ago. He Mingqi was silent and slowly closed the yellow oiled paper umbrella. Zhuge Warren said indifferently, please tell General Su Shi that apart from questioning the case, we also want this little maidservant. The prince has already entered the palace to ask His Majesty for a decree. The West Hill Divine Palace wants to take her back to Peach Mountain. Wang Jinglu frowned and said mockingly, do you think the West Hill Palace can suppress the Tang military ministry? Zhuge Warren frowned and said, according Tang, the military ministry of Tang military ministry, the military ministry of priest of the military Xingli. Zhe said, and ye priest of Wang, thou Wai, minister of the emperor, Wei Wang of Shi's. He Mingqi held his breath and kept quiet. Although there were many Taoists in the South School of Haotian Temple, who held great resentment for the little handmaiden in the old brush pen shop because of the death of Master Yen Sei, he did not think so. In the past, other than the imperial palace, any yamen or organization in the Tang Empire would subconsciously retreat when facing the military. However, today the Imperial Center Administration was determined to get such an important thing, and they even faintly mentioned the prince and the West Hill Divine Palace, so they refused to give in. There were no sparks between their words, but they forced each other into a dead end. In the end, according to Tang law, the only place qualified to interrogate Sang Sang was the Chong and local government where they were now. Wang Jinglu said, I heard that the prefectural magistrate has a fever and can't get up. Zhuge Warren said with a mocking smile, since the imperial doctors don't work, I have to ask the Imperial Center Administration to send some psyche masters to check on the prefectural magistrate. No matter how bad the fever is, he can at least hold on for a few sentences. Chong and local government was always the most wronged and bullied government in the Tang Empire. It was as helpless and painful as a daughter-in-law in a big family. Today, the military, the Imperial Center Administration, and the Southern Gate Temple gathered in the mansion, forcing the prefectural magistrate to pretend to be sick, and all the officials kept quiet. Zhuge Warren's gloomy words were heard in the backyard. Shangguan Yongyu, the prefectural magistrate, knew that he could no longer pretend to be sick. He rubbed his swollen throat weakly, thinking that the basin of ice water he poured on him yesterday afternoon was in vain. He sighed and shook his head. His wife said worriedly, if we don't offend the academy, we will offend so many people. What should we do? Shangguan Yongyu's ugly eyes flashed with a hint of ruthlessness. He sneered and said, you want to force me into a dead end, and then you want me to explain to Mr. 13 afterwards. Dream on. His wife asked in surprise, Master, have you come up with a good idea? Shangguan Yongyu looked at his old wife, who was deeply in love with him, and sighed. He said with pity, don't be afraid later. After saying this, the prefectural magistrate struggled to get up from the bed. He took out a hard elm stick from beside the desk, gasped painfully for several times, and then clenched his teeth and smashed it on his head. With a muffled sound, his head was immediately broken and blood flowed out. His vision turned black and he fainted just like that. This time he really fainted. The cry of the prefectural magistrate's wife resounded in the room. Just as the prefectural magistrate was putting on a show of who could be more miserable than him in the bedroom, someone came to the Chong and local government. The steward bowed to everyone respectfully and said, Her Highness is in the palace and couldn't come here in time, so she asked me to come and have a look. I don't know what mistake Miss Sang Sang has made to alarm so many officials. Wang Jinglu didn't expect that this matter would alarm Princess Liu so quickly. He frowned. He represented the empire's military, so he didn't have to give face to Her Highness. But now no one knew which prince the emperor would pass the throne to, so he had to be cautious about some things. Zhuge Warren didn't give any explanation to the steward, and expressed his attitude with silence. The steward was not angry. Before coming to the Chang and local government, he thought it was a misunderstanding. Seeing so many bigwigs present, he knew that things were not as simple as Her Highness thought. Presumably, the little handmaiden was responsible for something very important. After a slight smile, he said goodbye to everyone and informed the palace again as quickly as possible. As soon as the steward of the princess's mansion left, the latest news came from the back house. The prefectural magistrate was seriously ill, and he was worried about the people's welfare. He tried to get up to try the case, but unexpectedly, he hit the door because of a high fever and was now unconscious. It was rare to see such a diligent official, and such an excuse was also rare. How could Zhuge Warren and others believe it? They angrily broke into the back house, but after a while, they retreated with complicated expressions. Our Tang Empire has such a shameless official? Zhuge Warren said with emotion. He Mingqi thought of the horrible bloody hole on the prefectural magistrate's head and sighed. He's really ruthless, Wang Jinglu said. This lord would rather hurt himself than try the case. I admire him. Zhuge Warren suddenly said, in that case, I'll take the little handmaiden back to the palace first. Wang Jinglu frowned. Zhuge Warren said, someone from the palace will explain to the general later. Wang Jinglu still frowned. People came and went and the snow fell. The snow fell on the yellow paper umbrella, the branches, the eaves, and the bedding. Perhaps because the bedding was too big and covered the little girl holding it, or perhaps because the people coming and going were thinking about important things, they forgot that the person they were discussing was beside them. In short, Sang Sang, who was standing in the cold wind and bitter snow, was forgotten by people. So no one noticed that she also frowned. Sang Sang was a little girl who didn't want to cause trouble for Ning Quebec. So at the beginning, when the Chang and local government wanted to ask her about the case, she came. These people asked her to stand in front of the mansion. She stood in front of the mansion, stood in front of the garden, and waited in the wind and snow until she was sure that the official really wanted to rob her things, and even seemed to want to take her into the palace. Sang Sang was a person who would risk her life to fight with Ning Ke for 3 taels of silver, not to mention that the thing that these people wanted to rob from her was obviously worth more money, not to mention that it was originally left by her teacher and master Yen Sei to Ning Ke, so she frowned. Her frown showed her displeasure and disapproval. She poked her head out of the thick bedding with difficulty and looked at the shameless official who wanted to take her into the palace to rob her things. A very subtle light shone in the depths of her dark and bright eyes, and then that light quickly burned. Suddenly a cold wind blew. The solemn light in the depths of Song Song's eyes suddenly disappeared, and she slowly lowered her head. The wind was the flow of the air. The reason why the cold wind suddenly blew at this time was that a very large object suddenly appeared in the air. That object was a very fat young man. The young man was so fat that he appeared in the garden with a breath of the winter wind, and then quickly dispersed the winter wind, bringing a sense of warmth to everyone present, just like his delicate and lovely eyebrows. It seems to be very lively here. Sang Sang looked up at him and nodded gently to greet him. The fat young man looked at the 3 people present and said, if the Chang and prefectural magistrate dares to try the case, you can use the law of the Tang Empire to interrogate Sang Sang. If the Chang and prefectural magistrate keeps lying in bed, don't come out and make a fool of yourself. Zhuge Warren's face was stern. He looked at the man and shouted in a deep voice, who are you? How dare you speak so boldly? The fat young man didn't bother to pay attention to these people. He took the bedding in Song Song's arms and said, let's go. Sang Sang obediently followed him and prepared to leave, just as obediently as when she came. Wang Jinglu didn't know who the fat young man was, but he vaguely guessed his identity. Looking at the back of the fat young man, he couldn't help but feel a little excited. He flicked his sleeves and took a step forward. The fat young man stopped and looked back at him. A faint aura instantly crossed the distance between the two of them. The lingering breeze was not disturbed, and the slowly falling snowflakes were not trembling, but Wang Jinglu's body trembled violently. Wang Jinglu's eyes became more and more excited. His right hand hanging by his side trembled slightly, as if he was holding a virtual sword. The fat young man looked at his right hand and frowned slightly. He moved the bedding to his left shoulder with some difficulty, and then casually raised his right hand and stretched out his index finger to press down on Wang Jinglu from afar. With this press, Wang Jinglu's chest and abdomen suddenly sank, as if he had been hit by an invisible giant hammer. He suddenly hit the wall behind him, and there was a shocked and frightened voice among the dust and gravel. The non-boundary spirit. The natural stream magical finger. The snowflakes and dust gradually subsided. The fat young man looked at Wang Jinglu, who was under the broken wall with blood dripping from the corner of his mouth, and shook his head in boredom. Even if it's the invincible realm below knowing destiny. After all, it's only the invincible realm below knowing destiny. There is still a 5th chapter, but the time is not set. I will write it as soon as possible. See you later. I will continue to ask for monthly votes. At this time it's really a waste not to ask for them. Thank you everyone. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 335. Even if he was invincible below the knowing destiny state, he was still invincible below the knowing destiny state. It was a simple and even a little repetitive, but if one were to think about it carefully, there would be many other meanings. That kind of meaning was the strong confidence, hidden under the calmness and indifference. Because only grand cultivators who had entered the knowing destiny state were qualified to speak like this. There were countless people in the world who pursued Taoism, but very few could embark on the path of cultivation. Those who could finally enter the knowing destiny state were as few as the morning stars. Those few powerhouses either hid in the depths of the mountain gate of various sects or sat quietly at the top of the imperial court. They rarely appeared in front of the world. But today, such a person had appeared in the Chong and local government. Zhuge Warren looked at the young fat man in front of him with a very strange expression. He was a little excited, a little scared and a little confused. As the highest official of the Imperial Center Administration, he often visited the Nation Master and Master Huang Yang. He should be the person in the secular world who had seen the most grand cultivators in the knowing destiny state. However, he was still very shocked at this time because he could not imagine how someone could enter the knowing destiny state at such a young age. Even Prince Longqing, who was the most valued by Haotian Taoism, and Wang Jinglu, who was placed high hopes on by the Tang court, was only considered to have a high chance of entering the knowing destiny state. But this young fat man in front of him had easily crossed the threshold and sent Wang Jinglu flying into the wall from a distance. After a while, Zhuge Warren finally came to his senses. There was only one place in the world where such an incredible cultivation thing could happen, and that was the academy in the south of Chang'an City. Considering Ning Kei's identity as a student of the 2nd floor of the academy, the origin of the young fat man was obvious. He asked in a slightly hoarse voice, "May I ask which teacher you are?" After all, the official had overestimated the academy, so he asked what the young fat man's ranking was. In fact, among all the young cultivators in the current generation, only this young fat man had entered the knowing destiny state a few years ago, whether it was the back of the mountain of the academy, the Jishou Abbey, or the Xiankong Temple. Of course he was Chun Pippi. Chun Pippi looked at Wang Jinglu, who was struggling to stand up at the foot of the wall. Thinking of the things he had heard in the past, he couldn't help but shake his head and say, "It's natural for a cultivator to be proud and confident, but pride and confidence is not arrogance. I heard that you used to be fat, but now it seems that you don't even have this advantage." After saying this, he moved the thick bedding over his shoulder and was about to leave with Sang Sang. He did not expect Wang Jinglu's voice to ring out behind him again. "If you fight for months without sleep, you will also lose weight." Wang Jinglu wiped the blood from the corner of his lips and looked at his back as he continued. "The academy is not allowed to interfere in court affairs. I didn't expect the 2nd floor to send Mr. 12 to kidnap him today." After hearing his words, Zhuge Warren realized that this fat young man was Mr. 12 from the back of the mountain of the academy. He had asked Chun Pippi before, but Chun Pippi could not be bothered with him. The official's old face could not help but feel a little painful. He suppressed the shock in his heart and said coldly, "Mr. 12, don't you need to give me an explanation?" Chun Pippi looked at him expressionlessly and said, "You bully little girls. Do you think you deserve an explanation from me?" Wang Jinglu took out a handkerchief from his sleeve and covered his lips that kept coughing up blood. He coughed and said, "It seems that the Academy really values its own interests more than the world. Are you not even willing to let the imperial court interrogate a little maidservant?" Chun Pippi looked at the three of them and said with disgust, "I hate talking about court affairs and the world. You guys are always thinking about the dragon throne in the palace. Some people want to use this matter to test youngest brother's reaction, and some people even don't want youngest brother to be the nation master. What qualifications do people like you have to represent the world? Who wants to be the nation master? Who cares who sits on the dragon throne? You people are at a different state from the Academy, and you see a different world. Don't play these boring tricks. You always learn from those rural women and think about whether the Empress dips her green onion pancakes in sauce. It will only make people laugh." Chun Pippi didn't use any heavy words in his speech. He simply described the insurmountable gap between them, which naturally revealed an unquestionable sense of superiority and condescension. Lord Zhuge was trembling with anger. He Mingqi thought silently with a bitter and complicated smile on his lips. Only Wang Jinglu looked at him thoughtfully, and seemed to think of something else because of his words. Chun Pippi looked at the three of them and thought that youngest brother was not in Chong, and now. Otherwise, if he knew that someone in the imperial court dared to bully the little maidservant that he treasured more than money, who knew what kind of tragedy would happen? Immediately after that, he recalled second senior brother's solemn expression in the back mountain, and he couldn't help but shudder with lingering fear. He thought to himself that if he really let Sang Sang suffer any harm today, he would probably be smashed to death by his senior brother with his hat. Since second brother was here, not to mention the Imperial Center Administration, the Southern Gate Temple, the #1 military man of the Tang Empire, Su Shi, even His Majesty and Her Majesty could not stop Chun Pippi from taking Sang Sang away. Chun Pippi carried the quilt and Sang Sang and left the heavily guarded Chong and local government, trembling with every step. Before leaving, he said, "This is not over. We will talk about it when Ningke comes back." Lord Zhuge looked slightly serious. He Mingqi sighed softly. Wang Jinglu laughed at himself and left. An hour later, the picture of the rising sun on the background wall of the Cha and local government cracked open for no reason. The red sun and the blue ocean were separated into two different worlds, which made the crowd cry out in surprise. Perhaps it was because it sensed the danger hidden in those words. Perhaps it was just a warning from a fat student on the second floor of the academy to the Tang Empire. In the mansion of the Defender General of the state, Su Shi indifferently looked at the winter plum blossoms outside the window. His white hair was combed neatly and the wrinkles on his face seemed to be arranged in a battle array. The coughing sounds behind him did not affect him at all. As the most outstanding general of the Tang Empire, he had enough confidence to face many things. However, when he really did that, he found that things did not develop as he had imagined. Because Mr. 12 of the academy intervened, I could not keep the maidservant. How did Wei Guangming hide in Chong, and for such a long time? What is the real relationship between him and the maidservant? I still have no clue. As for the responsibility of the Imperial Center Administration and the Southern Gate Temple for the death of Master Yen Sei, it is not clear. Wang Jinglu looked at the mottled blood stains on the handkerchief and could not help but frown. Su Shi looked back at him and said, "You will cough blood for half a month." Wang Jinglu put the handkerchief into his sleeve and calmly replied, "It seems that it is worth coughing blood for half a year to see the legendary natural stream magical finger of Jishou Abbey, and feel the no-boundary spirit of the academy." Hearing this answer, Su Shi was somewhat satisfied and slowly nodded. Wang Jinglu looked at the old general by the window and smiled slightly. Nominally, he was a disciple of the Dragon Tiger Mountain, but in fact he was a rogue cultivator. The so-called breakthrough in cultivation all depended on self-understanding. The reason why he knew the Academy's no-boundary spirit and the natural stream magical finger of the unknown place was all from Su Shi. In the past 2 years, His Majesty had ordered him to follow the old general to fight in the southern frontier of the Tang Empire. Although the old general was gloomy and stubborn, he had carefully taught and cultivated him. After a long time together, he had developed a kind of respect and love for the old man, who was like a teacher or a father. The unknown place like the back of the mountain of the academy is too powerful. After a moment of silence, Wang Jinglu decided to confess his true thoughts to the general. If they have no intention of interfering in the court affairs, I think we should not challenge them. Hearing this, the wrinkles on Su Shi's face deepened. He said, "Who is the most powerful person in the world? It is not His Majesty or the Prime Minister, but a cultivator. I am also a cultivator, and I have seen the headmaster once. I have spent decades in the army, and I know the power of the academy better than anyone else. But first and foremost, I am a soldier of the Tang Empire, so I have to be vigilant against those powerful cultivators in the academy. If I am not vigilant, it will be a dereliction of duty as a soldier." Wang Jinglu said in a low voice, "If you want to use this matter to see if the academy still respects the law of the Tang Empire, I don't think it is appropriate. Because it is difficult to link the little maidservant with harboring a fugitive based on the existing evidence. I do want to see the attitude of the academy." Su Shi turned around and looked at the thin sky outside the window. He said in a slightly cold voice, "But I want to know more. Why did the academy do nothing when Wei Guangming stayed in Chang, and for such a long time? What is the relationship between the little maidservant and Wei Guangming? What does this matter have to do with him?" Wang Jinglu frowned slightly and shook his head. He said, "This kind of vigilance seems very unreasonable." Su Shi said, "As a Tang, no one is willing to provoke the academy. But this time so many people want to do something at the same time. First, it is because the maidservant is of a lowly status. Even if they do something to her, it will not affect the foundation of the academy. She is the best target. Second, the civil and military officials in the imperial court and even some nobles in the palace have begun to be vigilant against the academy, just like me." Wang Jinglu still could not understand why this vigilance against the academy came from. Su Shi said, "Why are so many people in the imperial court wary of the academy? Because this world is made up of the supermundane world and the secular world. Everything in the secular world has always been controlled by the supermundane world. The emperor of the Yueluan kingdom must be appointed by the elder of the White Tower Temple. The emperors of other countries in the world must be approved by the West Hill Divine Palace. Therefore, the Taoist hierarch and the three gods on Peach Mountain are the real masters of this world. Behind them are the unknown places of Buddhism and Taoism. If they can communicate with each other, they will be sages. If they can communicate with each other, they will need to enter the secular world. But why does the academy have to enter the secular world?" Wang Jinglu finally understood. In this cold winter, his back was instantly soaked with sweat. Since they were all in the human world, there was no such thing as outside the human world. Except for the Tang Empire, the rest of the world had been controlled by cultivators. If the academy also wanted to interfere in the human world like the West Hill Divine Palace, who could stop them? The academy cannot interfere with the imperial court. This is an iron law set by the headmaster. He seemed to suppress the uneasiness in his heart and said in a hoarse voice, "If the academy really wanted to act like the West Hill Divine Palace, it would have done so over the years." Su Shi looked at the dim sun outside the clouds. His eyes shone with a dim light. He said slowly, "I have never doubted the headmaster of the academy. But you have to know that no matter how great a man is, he will die of old age one day. Once the headmaster leaves this world, what if the people in the back of the mountain of the academy are not willing to be left out? If they start to interfere with the imperial court, the imperial power will fall and the country will no longer be a country. Will the Tang Empire still be the Tang Empire today?" Now that we have confirmed that Ningke is the one who entered the secular world from the academy would not have agreed to let him go to the frontier fortress and the wilderness. I have seen his resume in the military ministry. I have to admit that he is an excellent soldier. But the more he is, the more I am vigilant. Because an excellent soldier must be cold-blooded and ruthless. He must also have ambition. Whether it is for military achievements or territory, that kind of ambition is like a wildfire that cannot be extinguished. Su Shi said in a low voice, "The Tang Empire has been strong for thousands of years because we are not like those poor worms crawling at the feet of the divine hall. We are always in awe of the people outside the secular world. We have always been vigilant and never surrendered. I am so tired. I have written a lot these 2 days. Please pretend that you did not see the rough parts and the missing words. I will try to revise it in a few days. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 336. Wang Jinglu shook his head and said, however, the academy has existed for thousands of years. If something were to happen, it would have happened hundreds of years ago. I don't think it would have been left in our time. Su Shi said, that's because there has only been one headmaster in the academy for thousands of years. Only the headmaster can teach students who are capable of shaking the Tang Empire. Wang Jinglu thought of the natural stream magical finger that the fat young man in the Chang and local government had casually displayed. He lowered his head and said nothing. Su Shi said coldly, birth, old age, sickness and death are the destinies that Haoyan has arranged for human beings. If the headmaster is still alive, we don't have to worry about him. However, if he is, you must not hand over the safety of Chang and the Tang Empire to Ning Quebec. I don't care what you do, you must take back the array I. Wang Jinglu remained silent. He Mingqi's yellow oiled paper umbrella did not completely block his hearing. Moreover, he knew what the Imperial Center administration wanted from the little handmaiden. Why are you so insistent? He could not help but ask. Su Shi squinted as he recalled the past. The deep wrinkles on his face were like gullies that had been washed by the rain. He said in a hoarse voice, because the academy once had a madman coup. I don't want another madman Ning to appear in the world. Any madman may cause the entire Tang Empire to die with them. After saying this, the old general began to cough violently. His painful coughs echoed in the spacious room, like the sound of a war drum on the battlefield that was gradually breaking down. After a long time, he finally straightened his body with difficulty. The Tang Emperor Li Zhongyi sat on the couch and looked at his younger brother calmly. He listened carefully to his explanation. Suddenly, he frowned in pain and hurriedly covered his mouth with a handkerchief to stop his coughing. I don't know why you are so angry. Even if it's because of your friendship with Master Yan Sei, it doesn't make sense. However, the Imperial Center Administration and the Southern Gate Temple asked the little handmaiden not because they are against Ning Ke or the Academy. The key is that those things are too important to be left outside the palace. Prince Li Peiyan did not notice the pained expression on the emperor's face. However, he did not hear any sound coming from the direction of the couch after explaining seriously for a long time. He could not help but feel a little anxious. He continued, that little maidservant herself is very strange. The divine priest of light has been with her for so long in the old brush pen shop. I always feel that there is something strange about this matter. He looked up at His Majesty and said seriously, after being reprimanded by my brother, I have deeply repented and understood the foundation of the Tang Empire. However, I came to the palace at the invitation of the West Hill with a different idea. The Divine Hall wants to summon the little maidservant back to Peach Mountain, and it seems that they have no evil intentions. According to the information of the Imperial Center Administration, the Divine Hall even intends to let the little maidservant inherit the position of the Divine Priest of Light. That little maidservant is a Tang and Ning Ke's maidservant. If she could inherit the position of Great Divine Priest of Light in the future, it would be good for the Empire. That depends on whether Ning Ke is willing or not. The Emperor thought for a moment, then shook his head and waved his hand for Li Peiyan to leave. The dim winter sunlight shone on the smooth gold bricks on the ground, and then on the gorgeous furnishings in the quiet bedchamber, forming hundreds of beautiful dark paintings. His Majesty looked at the vase of plum blossoms in front of the bed, and a smile appeared on his lips. Then he bent down and coughed violently. At this time, the prince had already left the palace, and there was no one else in the palace. As the monarch of a country, he finally did not need to suppress himself, so his cough seemed to be particularly painful, or rather happy. The golden curtain slightly swayed, and the Empress walked out with a bowl of medicine. She slowly sat beside him, stretched out her plump arm and patted his back, and gently said, "Drink the medicine." The couple in the Tang Palace was really an anomaly among the emperors and empresses in the empire for thousands of years. They had a deep relationship, and had never been separated since the death of the former empress. Now there were even no other concubines in the palace, and they stuck together like newlyweds in daily life. The eunuchs and palace maids in the palace had long been accustomed to the way the emperor and empress got along, so they had long been far away during the feeding time. The emperor took the bowl and looked at the black medicine soup in the bowl. He frowned and said, "I'm a little tired of drinking it for so many years." The empress persuaded, "This is the order of the dean. Your Majesty must drink it." The emperor sighed helplessly, took the medicine soup, and drank it in one gulp. Then he grabbed a handkerchief and carelessly wiped his mouth. The empress took the handkerchief and put it in her sleeve. When she pulled out her hand from the sleeve, there was a green leaf candy in her palm. She skillfully fed it to the emperor. It seemed that she had often done this over the years. The emperor held the cool candy in his mouth and leaned on the empress's arms. He comfortably squinted his eyes and said, "This kind of life is really comfortable. I wouldn't trade it for being an emperor." The empress chuckled and said, "You're an emperor and you're still so talkative." As she spoke, she gently punched the emperor and then patted his back to soothe his breath. The emperor smiled and said, "I can't be talkative? That's why I said I wouldn't trade it for being an emperor." He thought of Li Peiyan's previous report and raised his eyebrows. He laughed and said, "In comparison, I do envy Ning Quebec. That guy is luckier than me. He can learn from the headmaster of the academy and he can be talkative. Now it seems that the little maidservant beside him is much better than the girl beside me. At least she doesn't force him to drink medicine every day." Hearing Ning Kei's name, the empress smiled but did not say anything. The emperor sat up straight and looked at her. He said, "Although I hate that old bastard Wei Guangming to the core, I also admire and respect his ability. Ning Kei's maidservant actually has the opportunity to become his successor. It's really amazing. When there's a chance, summon her to the palace and see what's so special about this little maidservant. At the same time, comfort her. After all, she must have suffered a lot today." Ning Kei won't say anything on the surface, but he must have his own thoughts. The empress nodded and said softly, "I'll arrange it." The emperor looked at her, who was as gentle as usual, and suddenly said, "Let Zhuge resign by himself." The empress was patting his back. When she heard this, her right hand stiffened. Zhuge Warren of the Imperial Center Administration had always fawned on her. This was never a secret in the palace. Then she continued to pat his back and said calmly, "I know." The emperor looked at her eyes and said after a moment of silence, "The imperial court has already reprimanded Tuyang City. It's a big crime to mobilize troops without an imperial edict. I wonder how Xiahou is going to explain it to me this time." The empress's eyelashes fluttered slightly. This involved her brother, who loved her the most, and she did not know what else she could do except to remain silent. The emperor looked at her tightly pursed lips and sighed softly. He said, "The devil's doctrine believes in power. They are silent in the world and do not meet Haotian. They are the most stubborn and fierce. You have been so stubborn since then, let alone him. I'm afraid Xiahou is still not willing to retreat this time." The empress raised her head and looked at his eyes calmly. She said, "I will write to persuade him." The emperor nodded and said, "That's good." The empress suddenly said, "His Highness said he did not understand why the military was angry. In my opinion, many people in the imperial court are wary of the academy and the academy after the departure of the headmaster. Your Majesty should pay attention to this undercurrent." Before the imperial astronomer made the comment that the country would not be peaceful under the night curtain, the empress was often seen in the imperial study of the Tang Empire reviewing memorials for the emperor. After that, the public pressure of the engagement between Princess Li Yu and the Chan Yu of the Golden Tribe of the Grassland made the empress much quieter. She never dealt with the affairs of the state again. However, when she was in private with the emperor, she would occasionally express her opinions as she did many years ago. The emperor respected his wife's opinion very much because he knew she had the ability to do so. He shook his head and said with a smile, "I will not be wary of the academy. In fact, in my opinion, any Tangs who do not fully trust the academy are not qualified to sit at the top of the empire, because it shows that they do not understand the Tang Empire at all." As for Sushar, the emperor frowned slightly. He did not have any good way to deal with this hardworking military general. He said. He is loyal to the country and has made many contributions in the past decades. However, his temperament is a little cold and easily angered. Moreover, his lung disease is getting worse. I don't know how long he will live. It is inevitable for a dying man to see the world in a gloomy light. It is normal for him to be vigilant and uneasy. The Empress wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. There was some worry in her eyes. The Emperor held her hand and said with a smile, "You are still young. Our child is still young. So you should not be so gloomy. You must remember that without the headmaster of the academy and the academy, we could not be together. The academy is as important to the Tang Empire as you are to me. I will never doubt or hesitate." The Empress smiled. Then she tilted her body slightly. When the Emperor wasn't paying attention, she took out the handkerchief she had stuffed in before. Using the light to examine it, she didn't see any bloodstains. Only then did the smile on her face become truly happy. She used to be the saintess of the diabolism, and was now the Empress of the Tang Empire. However, she thought that she was just an ordinary woman in the palace. She did not want to think about other things. She only wanted her husband and son to be safe and happy. The Academy's entry into the human realm will make many people vigilant and uneasy. For example, the military generals who have taken protecting the Tang Empire as their mission, because it is the first time that they have found a threat in the world that cannot be solved by force. But for some people in Chang'an, the Academy's entry into the human realm is a precious opportunity for them. They can use the Academy's power or attitude to fight for things that they are not sure to get. Under the dark eaves of the princess mansion was a terrace made of nanmu. There was a copper brazier on the terrace. Liu looked at the charcoal in the brazier quietly and began to tell Prince Li Huiyuan a story that had not yet happened. I will write 5 more chapters today. This is the first chapter. Then I will explain that I really don't have a manuscript. I also want to have such a glorious thing as a manuscript. However, everyone knows that I have been stupid for so many years. So I can only work hard these days. I will try to finish the second chapter before 8. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 337. The dragon throne in the palace is something that no one is sure to get. Especially you and me. Her Majesty has General Xiao's loyalty in the army. Old Zhuge of the Imperial Center Administration flatters her among the cultivators. Uncle Prince supports her in the royal family. The nation master is on good terms with her. And even the Prime Minister favors her. She had already grasped too many things in her hands. She was worried that there would be a change. She was worried that the Academy's entry into the human realm would cause a gust of cold wind to blow into her palms and turn those things into nothingness. This would affect the ownership of the dragon chair. So she was very vigilant. This fear has been lurking in the hearts of many people. Even if she can keep calm, those who are loyal to her can't. That is why these things happen today. And we have nothing. Hua Shangyue and the others are still young. It will be many years before they take over the positions of Su Shi and Xiahou in the army. Some of the scholars in Chang'an have entered the court, but it is still too early for their voices to be heard in the court. So I welcome the Academy's entry into the human realm. Because when the Academy enters the human realm and the day the Tang Empire invades, no matter how many people support the Empress, as long as the Academy clearly conveys its attitude, the ministers, the military and the cultivators must remain silent. Why can I be sure of the Academy's attitude? Because the Academy's entry into the human realm is Ning Quebec. I know Ning Quebec. Ning Ke is indifferent and heartless. He may not help me because of the past, and he may even ignore this matter. But there are some things that he must care about. Even if he doesn't care, Sang Sang will care about it. Everyone in Chang'an thinks that Sang Sang is just an ordinary maidservant. Interestingly, I know that this is not the truth. Fortunately, I have always liked Sang Sang, and Sang Sang also likes me very much. When I am about to die, Sang Sang will definitely care about me. Then Ning Ke will have to care about me, and the Academy will also express its attitude. Dear brother, why will I die? Because in the fight for the throne, failure means death. Liu ended the story that had not happened. She picked up the copper chopsticks and carefully arranged the pile of silver charcoal in the brazier. She looked up at her brother and smiled. Then she got up and went to the study. In the study, Liu wrote a letter to Crown Prince Chongming of the Yan Kingdom. This letter would be sent directly to the capital of the Yan Kingdom, Changjing Palace, via Hua Shangyue of the Gushan Commandery. This choice had nothing to do with speed, but out of prudence. In the letter, she talked about the recent events in Chang and city and casually mentioned her relationship with the master and servant of the old brush pen shop. Finally, she expressed her sincere condolences for the disappearance of Prince Long Qing. In the capital of the Yan Kingdom, it was snowing in the palace. Crown Prince Chongming's eyes left the letter in his hand and looked at the swirling snowflakes outside the columns. A strategist could not hide the joy on his face. He bowed to Crown Prince Chongming and congratulated him. If Mr. 13 really represents the Academy and enters the human realm, according to the relationship described by the princess in the letter, the throne of the Tang Empire will probably fall into the hands of Prince Li Huiyuan in the future. Your Highness, you have a good relationship with Princess Liu. This is a perfect situation for you and even for the Yan Kingdom after you take charge. Crown Prince Chongming clearly understood the wishes expressed by Princess Liu through this letter. He understood that the princess wanted to boost his confidence. If Long Qing really died, then there would only be one heir to the throne of the Yan Kingdom. He would undoubtedly be the biggest beneficiary, not to mention that the Tang Emperor would support him in the future. Now many people knew that Prince Long Qing was defeated by Ning Ke of the Academy and disappeared. No one knew whether he was dead or alive. Logically speaking, he should thank Ning Ke and celebrate. However, he did not show any joy in the face of his subordinates' congratulations. The world thinks that Long Qing and I are fighting for the throne and our hatred is irreconcilable. However, you seem to have forgotten that we are brothers of the same blood. We used to play together in the palace. Now I don't know where he is or if he is still alive. Do you really think that I can be happy? Crown Prince Chongming stared blankly at the dancing snowflakes in the palace and began to cry for no reason. The strategist looked at the tears flowing down the Crown Prince's face and could not help but be shocked. He hurriedly knelt down and kowtowed to ask for forgiveness. However, he was extremely happy in his heart. He thought to himself that the prince whom he had served so loyally did not forget to pretend to be brothers at such a time and refused to let the emperor and others see any flaws. He was really worth following. The South Jin Kingdom was located in the south and the climate was warm. Therefore, there was no snow in the middle of winter. The rock mountain that looked like a giant sword reflected the winter sun. Every crack and every hole was so clear, just like the old black and white pavilion at the foot of the mountain, revealing a cold and proud sword style. Over the years, many people found that in order to go further on the long road of cultivation, a cultivator's own willpower, luck and opportunity were indispensable. The so-called willpower was often incomparably firm and proud. Liu Bai, the sage of sword, who was quietly cultivating in the ancient pavilion and was recognized as the strongest person in the world, was undoubtedly extremely proud and confident. His pride and confidence even exceeded the scope of firmness and seemed to be without reason. The calm and sharp voice of the sage of sword sounded in the ancient pavilion. This voice seemed to pierce through the clouds and pierce the eardrums of all the disciples. A few months ago, I once said that the shameful people should not come back. Then why did you come back? The disciples of the sword Garrett lowered their heads in shock and uneasiness. They thought that they had accepted the edict of the divine hall to go to the wilderness. These days they had fought with the grassland people and the desolate man. They were bathed in blood and never retreated. How did they embarrass their sect? In the depths of the black and white ancient pavilion, there was a small green pond and a thatched hut. It turned out that from here to the peak there was actually a big hole eroded by time. At this time the sun had moved and the cave was quiet. A man with long hair was sitting under the sunlight. No one could feel the strong aura of this person. However, if someone dared to look directly at his figure, they would soon feel an unbearable pain in their eyes. They might even cry and become blind. Because the man's loose hair, the belt around his waist, the hanging sleeves, and even his gaze and back were all swords. This man himself was a sword that could cross the heaven and earth. Go to Chang'an and see what kind of person Ning Ke is. Back then, He could kill the disciples of the sword Garrett before he could cultivate. Now that he has become a student of the headmaster of the academy, how much progress will he make? The weakest world wayfarer of the academy in history? I don't believe this. Moreover, as long as he is the world wayfarer of the academy, even the weakest in history is enough to polish your spirit. A young man was kneeling in front of the thatched hut. The man was tall and slender, but he still looked like a big tree when he knelt on the ground. Listening to the sword-like voice of Lu Bai, the sage of sword by the pond, his face turned slightly pale. He forced himself to calm down his turbulent sense of perception and said in confusion, "But when I go there, I'm afraid that he has already returned to Chang'an. So what if he is in Chang'an? Yin Se would rather perish together with Wei Guangming than fight me again. Now, I want to see who is stronger, the successor he left behind or my successor. You don't have to worry that the academy will stop you from challenging him. Since the successor of the academy wants to enter the human realm, he must be prepared to be challenged continuously and be prepared to be killed at any time. Mr. Ke killed his way through the human realm like this. Now, how can Ning Ke be an exception?" Not long after the new year, it was the Lantern Festival. At night, Chang'an became a sea of lights. Countless families of people went out. Children ran around with candy sticks in their hands. Young girls smiled shyly and snuggled up to their lovers while secretly rolling their eyes. Countless shoes, hats, and purses were left behind on the streets. Compared with the lively and joyful atmosphere among the people, the atmosphere in the palace was naturally more solemn and dignified. That night, His Majesty and Her Majesty invited the high-ranking officials of the court to the palace for a banquet. After the banquet, His Majesty continued to appreciate calligraphy and drink with the civil officials. Her Majesty, on the other hand, asked a few of her closest wives to go to her own hall to continue talking. Both the Prime Minister's wife and the Grand Secretary's wife had to be calm and collected on such occasions. However, when they saw Liu behind the plan, they still couldn't help but show a surprised expression. The Tang Empire was prosperous and the people were at peace. The only thing that worried the court was the succession of the throne. Everyone knew that Her Majesty wanted her son to sit on the throne in the future. However, Princess Liu did not hesitate to think that only her own brother was qualified to be the future emperor. There had been no open conflict between them, but there had been many secret conflicts. The princess married to the grassland and the empress rarely stepped into the imperial study were all related to this matter. Today they could actually see Her Highness on such an occasion. Could it be that they were really going to make peace? In their shock, the madams did not notice the little handmaiden sitting quietly beside Liu. Liu did not want to come at all. However, she was very vigilant that Her Majesty wanted to see Sang Sang. Now that many people knew that Ning Ke was the one who wanted the academy to enter the human realm, winning Ning Ke's support was equivalent to winning the support of the academy to a large extent. What did Her Majesty want to see Sang Sang for? The madams present were close to Her Majesty and had their own inclinations. However, thinking of their master's position in the court, they always acted cautiously. They all came forward to greet Liu, except for one lady who was indifferent. This lady was the wife of Zheng Jing, the Grand Secretary of the Imperial Library. This lady used to be a favorite concubine in Zheng Jing's mansion. She had just given birth to a daughter and was killed by the first wife. If Her Majesty had not found out about this and sent a furious letter to Zheng Jing's mansion, she would have died quietly. How could she have the glory of a first-ranked noblewoman now? Because of this history, Mrs. Zheng was very grateful to Her Majesty. As long as Her Majesty was happy, she could even sacrifice her master's life, let alone her master's future. Therefore, when the Prime Minister's wife and others smiled and greeted Liu, she just sat behind the table indifferently and had no intention of coming forward. She looked at the little handmaiden beside Liu and frowned slightly. She thought that Her Highness was becoming more and more presumptuous. She even dared to bring a handmaiden to Her Majesty's banquet. However, looking at the little handmaiden's slightly tanned face and bright willow-shaped eyes, Mrs. Zheng felt as if she had seen her somewhere before. She felt an inexplicable sense of pity and heartache for her. The writing is getting slower and slower. I don't know when the third chapter will be finished. Continue to ask for monthly votes. I'm almost caught up. I'm so nervous. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 338. For the rest of the night, Mrs. Zeng was either immersed in or confused by this inexplicable feeling. When the Empress told a joke, she was no longer the first to laugh and the loudest. When the Prime Minister's wife talked about the interesting things in Chang'an, she no longer added fuel to the fire. Instead, she stared at the skinny, dark-skinned handmaiden beside Princess Liu. And the more she stared, the more entranced she became. Her different behavior naturally attracted some people's attention, especially when the noblewomen noticed that she was staring in the direction of Her Royal Highness. They felt even more strange. The wife of a minister sitting next to her reminded her several times. Seeing that she was still in a daze, she couldn't help but gently bump into her. The wife of the minister lowered her voice and asked with concern, "Why are you so distracted today?" Mrs. Zeng forced a smile and did not explain because she really could not. She did not understand why the more she looked at the little handmaiden, the more she felt close to her, and the more she doted on her. The Empress had gathered many people to chat and drink tea, but there was an inconspicuous little handmaiden among them. Moreover, she was sitting next to Her Royal Highness the Princess, which inevitably aroused many doubts in the minds of the madams. After the teacups were changed twice, the Prime Minister's wife finally couldn't help but ask. The Empress smiled and briefly introduced Sang. Only then did the madams know that this little girl was Sir Ning's personal handmaiden. Even though they still had many doubts, they did not ask further. Moreover, they were of noble status, and although they could not treat their own handmaidens like pigs and dogs, they were indeed people from two different worlds. They only asked about Ningke casually for the sake of the Empress. Mrs. Zeng looked at her companions talking to the little handmaiden, and could not help but ask as well. However, she did not care about how many paintings Sir Ning could write every day. Instead, she asked about Song's age. Sang was not used to the atmosphere in the imperial palace. If not for the imperial edict and Liu's promise to accompany her, she would rather cook porridge in the old brush pen shop. Especially after having a meal served by the palace maids, she felt that Ningke was right. The imperial palace was not a place to eat. When those noble women asked her questions, she felt a little tired. Until someone asked her about her age, she thought it was a simple question and immediately answered seriously. "I was born in the first year of the Tianqi era." Mrs. Zeng lowered her head and looked at her fingers stretching out of her sleeves. After a while, she realized that she was about to turn 15 this year. After a slight pause, she said sadly, "If my child had lived to this day, he would be as old as you." At this time, the noble ladies in the hall were all close to the Empress. Of course, they knew about the uproar in Chang, and in the first year of the Tianqi era, where a fierce woman killed her concubine and son. Hearing this, they could not help but cast a comforting look at Mrs. Zeng. The Empress comforted her with a few words. Mrs. Zeng glanced at the little handmaiden behind the desk and smiled bitterly. She thought to herself that she must have missed her daughter who had passed away so much that she lost her composure when she saw a little girl of the same age as her. She really shouldn't have. There were many things in the world that could not be erased by other means once they were triggered. Just like Mrs. Zeng's inexplicable pity for Sang. She wanted to convince herself that she was only thinking about her daughter who had died young, but she could not help but look up at the tea table and stare at Sang from time to time. The more she looked at Sang, the more familiar she felt, especially the girl's slightly tanned skin and her willowy eyes that were not very beautiful in the eyes of ordinary people. She could not help but ask again, "I heard from you that you and Sir Ning had lived in the city of Wei in your early years. Is it because the sun at the frontier fortress is too hot that you are tan like this?" Sang was slightly startled and shook her head. "Young master said that I have been tanned since I was young." Hearing her answer, Mrs. Zeng became more and more restless. She no longer cared about the strange looks of others and stared at Sang intently, as if she wanted to see what was on her face. The banquet ended and the people left. Mrs. Zeng was guarding outside the hall. When she saw Liu coming out with Sang, she gritted her teeth and stopped the two of them. Liu frowned slightly, not knowing what the wife of the Grand Secretary wanted to do. Mrs. Zhang knew very well that as the strongest supporter of the Empress, she had not been nice to the princess all these years. It could even be said that she had offended the princess badly. Therefore, her tone was even more gentle and humble. Your Highness, I felt close to this girl today. And you also know my child. I want to send this girl home. Please allow me to, Your Highness. Li Yu looked at her quietly. She even mentioned her daughter who died 15 years ago. It seemed that the wife of the Grand Secretary really wanted to go with Sang Sang. But why did she do this? Could it be that the Empress finally realized the importance of the Academy entering the human realm and decided to take a roundabout way to get close to Ningke? Thinking of these things, she decided to reject her humble request. She smiled and said, Sang Sang doesn't like to get along with strangers. This was the truth. Song Song's character meant that she didn't like to get along with people. If they hadn't interacted frequently in the past 2 years, even Li Yu wouldn't have been able to enter her world, not to mention the wife of the Grand Secretary whom she had never met before. However, at this moment Sang Sang, who had been standing quietly beside Li Yu, suddenly said, Okay, you are Sang Sang? Yes. This name is interesting. It's all right. Who named you? Young Master. Your young master is a contemporary calligrapher, so he must be very talented in poetry. The name he chose must be good. But I wonder what the meaning of Sang Sang is? No deep meaning. Young Master said that when he found me, there was a leafless mulberry tree by the roadside. It looked very similar to me, so he called me Sang Sang. Where did your young master find you? Hebei County. He forgot the specific place. We went to look for it once after we left Min Mountain, but there were already green sprouts in the fields. The leafless mulberry tree had died and many other trees had grown, so we couldn't recognize it. Tonight Chang'an City was brightly lit and full of tourists. The street to the eastern city was completely blocked by people who came to watch the lanterns. Even the carriage of the Grand Secretary of the Imperial Library could not speed up and could only move forward slowly with the crowd. However, Mrs. Zhang, who was in the carriage, did not care. She was even a little happy. The longer the journey, the longer she could stay in the carriage with Sang Sang and ask more questions. Tonight, Sang Sang was clearly a little different from usual. She answered every question the madam asked, and the number of words she spoke tonight seemed to be more than the number of words she spoke last month. However, those stories were too vague in her memory. Most of them were told by Ningke, so no matter how hard Mrs. Zhang tried, she still couldn't get the answer she wanted. No matter how long the journey was, there would be a moment when they would reach the destination. The carriage of the Grand Secretary's mansion slowly stopped at the entrance of Lin 47th Street. Sang Sang politely bowed to Mrs. Zhang when she got off the carriage. Mrs. Zhang stared at the slender figure in front of the shop and felt a twinge in her heart. She couldn't confirm anything and even knew that she might be delusional. However, along the way, she had fallen in love with the little girl, and thought how good it would be if she had a daughter like her. Mrs. Zhang lifted the curtain and asked hesitantly and uneasily, Are you willing to be a guest in the Grand Secretary's mansion? Sang Sang thought for a while with the key in her hand. She thought that Ningke would only be home for a few days and the pine branches and bacon were already smoked. There was no need for him to look after them, and there was nothing for her to do in the old brush pen shop. She nodded. A few days later, a strange guest came to the Grand Secretary's mansion of the Imperial Library. It was strange because the guest was a little handmaiden. There were so many mansions of princes and ministers in Chang'an City, but none of them would treat a little handmaiden as a proper guest. Therefore, when the housekeeper led the little handmaiden to the depths of the back garden, the servants and maids under the winter willow by the roadside pointed at them in shock. When the servants in the manor saw the wife of the Grand Scholar Dowager welcoming them at the gate of the garden and holding the little handmaiden's hand affectionately, and the smile on her face almost overflowed from her temples and flew up to the rockery, they were shocked to the extreme. It didn't take long for the servants in the Grand Secretary's mansion to find out the identity of the little handmaiden and her background. They couldn't help but talk about it. Many of them held back their laughter and thought that their wife was indeed the most loyal one to the Empress in Chang'an City. She was even willing to lower her status to make the Empress happy. Grand Secretary Zheng Jing was not in the mansion. Perhaps he, like the servants in the mansion, felt that it was beneath his wife's status to specially invite a little handmaiden to the banquet. Therefore, there were only Mrs. Zeng and Sang Sang at the luncheon. The dishes were extremely rich, and there were 4 or 5 maids serving them calmly at the table. Sang Sang had been serving others her entire life, or more accurately serving Ning Quebec. She was not used to being served, so she was a little restrained and quieter than she was in the horse carriage on the night of the Lantern Festival. Mrs. Zeng looked at her as she lowered her head to eat the food in the bowl. Pity flashed in her eyes occasionally. Then, she gave a look to the most capable maid beside her. The maid understood. She lifted the curtain and went out to bring in a bowl of pigeon soup that had been prepared earlier. Mrs. Zeng walked to Sang Sang with the pigeon soup and said, "Look at your small figure. You need nourishment." With that, her hand slipped and the bowl of pigeon soup fell at Sang Sang's feet. Sang Sang stood up and looked down at her wet cotton skirt and shoes. She remained silent. Mrs. Zeng panicked and said, "This is really. Hurry up and wash." Her cotton skirt and shoes were stained with pigeon soup. They indeed needed to be washed. But Sang Sang did not move. She only looked down at her skirt and shoes in silence. She realized that the lady had poured the pigeon soup on her on purpose. Because at that moment, she clearly saw that the lady's fingers were holding the bowl of pigeon soup tightly and did not slip at all. Sang Sang was not angry because the bowl of pigeon soup had obviously been placed outside the curtain for a long time. It was already lukewarm. Not to mention being poured on her body, even if it was poured on her face, it would not cause any harm. Moreover, she could not feel the lady's malice. Instead, she could feel the lady's timid kindness. But why did she do that? Chapter 3. There are 2 more chapters. Those who don't want to stay up late can go to bed first. It's the same tomorrow. I will definitely write it before bed. Clench your fists and cheer for yourself. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 339. Sang Sang often lowered her head. She didn't like to look at people, but she was good at it. In the words of the great divine priest of light, Sang Sang was transparent from the inside out, like a crystal in the deep mountains. She could reflect the truest colors of the world, so she knew for sure who was good to her in this world. Unfortunately, after so many years, she had only met one person like Ning Ke, and he had died not long ago. But she could feel Mrs. Zeng's kindness, so she followed her advice and followed her into the inner chamber. She untied her dirty cotton dress, took off her shoes and put her feet into the warm water. Sang Sang's feet were very small, and her skin color was different from the rest of her body. It was as white as snow, and looked like 2 small white flowers slowly rippling in the clear water in the pot. See my book for more details. Ha ha ha. The Coming Night, Volume 1, The Empire in the Morning, Chapter 25, The First Dream. Mrs. Zeng hadn't blinked since she entered the bedroom. When Sang Sang undid her cotton dress, she clenched her fists nervously in her sleeves. When she took off her shoes, her nails almost dug into her palms. When she saw Sang Sang's delicate feet in the basin, she almost fainted. Mrs. Zeng didn't faint, but she had been in a state of slight dizziness since then. When Sang Sang returned to the dining table, Mrs. Zeng carried a pot of pigeon soup to her with trembling hands. She said in a trembling voice, "You must have suffered a lot these years. Take this opportunity to nourish yourself." Sang Sang looked at the appetizing oil flour in the pot and the tender pigeon in the soup and was slightly stunned. She thought to herself that she seemed to have heard it once before, but why did it sound a little different this time? In the evening, Grand Secretary Zeng Jing returned to the mansion. Mrs. Zeng straightforwardly, even rudely, drove away the subordinates who came to see the Grand Secretary. Then she walked up to him. Before she could say anything, her eyes turned red and 2 streams of tears flowed down her cheeks. Grand Secretary Zeng Jing was also a ruthless man. Otherwise, he wouldn't have taken only one night to divorce his wife from Qinghe County, kill his 3 stewards, and join the Empress's camp. However, he was very clear that his current position in the court depended on Foreign's position in front of the Empress. Adding on the old matters of the past, he had always doted on his wife. Seeing her cry before she spoke, he couldn't help but jump in fright. Madam, what happened at home? His voice trembled as he asked. He thought that with Madam's temperament, she would not have lost her composure like this unless it was a tragedy that she could not bear. Mrs. Zeng wiped the tears off her face and forced a smile. Master, it's a good thing. Zeng Jingyi asked, what is it? Mrs. Zeng looked at his face and said with a smile while crying, I found our daughter. After learning about what had happened in the palace on the night of the Lantern Festival and what had happened in the mansion today, Zhang Jing looked at his wife in disbelief and asked, You mean that little handmaiden is our daughter? Are you sure? Mrs. Zeng glared at him and said, She is my daughter, of course I can confirm it. Zhang Jing was also surprised by the sudden news. He stood up and asked, Do you have proof? Mrs. Zeng said unhappily, I already said that she is my daughter, why do I need proof? Zhang Jing smiled bitterly and said, My good wife, don't hide it from your husband anymore. With your temperament, you wouldn't tell me if you didn't have proof. You must have poured the pigeon soup today on purpose. Mrs. Zeng covered her mouth and laughed. She said, I really can't hide it from you. I asked Chunlan to cool the pigeon soup so that I could pour it on the child's feet so that she would take off her shoes and let me see her feet. Guess what? Her feet are still the same as when she was born more than 10 years ago, white and tender like 2 lotus flowers. Zhang Jing was slightly startled and asked, Other than this, do you have any other proof? Mrs. Zeng said, After I gave birth to that poor child next to the woodshed, I was worried that she would be swapped. I checked her carefully before I passed out. There was indeed no birthmark on her body, but her body was as black as charcoal and her feet were white and tender. Isn't this proof? I don't believe that anyone could look like that poor child. Zhang Jing thought of that day that he would remember for the rest of his life. He thought of the blood across the alley and the chaos in his mansion. He remembered that his fierce wife had used the color of the baby girl's body as an excuse to accuse her concubine of giving birth to an evildoer. Then, she had secretly ordered a few stewards to steal the baby girl out of the mansion. Could that little handmaiden from the old brush pen shop really be his long-lost daughter? But shouldn't she have died long ago? He seemed to be thinking of something as his brows relaxed and furrowed, looking very troubled. Mrs. Zeng still felt a dull pain in her palm. She said, Why are you hesitating, master? Hurry up and inform the Chong and local government, then think of a way to bring our daughter back. I tried my best not to tell her, thinking that everything would be fine once you came back. I can't bear to see my daughter being someone else's handmaiden for another day. You haven't seen that child. Her little hands are so rough that even I feel flustered when I touch them. I don't know how much she has suffered over the years. I heard from her that she does all the laundry, cooking, boiling water, and making tea in the shop. She even has to repair the shop door when it is broken. People like us don't order their servants around like that. I really don't know what kind of wicked thing her young master is to order her around like a cow. No, I have to go now. As she spoke, she thought of the evil young master of the Sang Sang family. Her tears flowed again and she could no longer control her emotions. She walked out of the study, looking like she was going to the old brush pen shop to pick up her daughter. Stop right there. Zhang Jing shouted. After a moment of silence, he frowned and sighed. He said, It would be easy if our daughter was really a handmaiden in an ordinary family. But do you know who the young master she is serving now is? That Ning Kei is not an ordinary person. He is the legendary owner of the flower-blooming calligraphy. He is highly favored by His Majesty. I just remembered that the name at the beginning of the chicken soup calligraphy was Sang Sang. Mrs. Zeng was slightly startled. She had been distracted when she saw Sang Sang in the palace that night and had forgotten about the Empress's introduction. It was only now that she realized that the immoral thing she had been cursing was not just any son of an unscrupulous official in Chong, but the person that the old master had often mentioned a few days ago. I remember now. The Empress did mention Sir Ning's name. Mrs. Zeng said, But so what? Even if His Majesty likes his calligraphy, it is only right and proper for us to bring back our daughter. Who would be unscrupulous enough to stop us? I think His Majesty would be happy to see this. Zhang Jing frowned and said, But do you know Ning Kei's other identity? What identity? He is a student of the second floor of the academy. Mrs. Zeng asked blankly. There is a second floor of the academy? Zhang Jing said in a low voice. There are many floors in the academy. Mrs. Zhang frowned and did not explain further. What is the second floor? Zhang Jing replied. Those who can study on the second floor of the academy are all core disciples of the headmaster of the academy. Mrs. Zhang was even more confused as to why her master mentioned these completely unrelated things. She asked, "Who is the headmaster of the academy?" Zhang Jing looked at her and shook his head, sighing, "What a foolish woman. The headmaster of the academy is the headmaster of the academy." Hearing the words headmaster of the academy, Mrs. Zhang finally understood the severity of the situation. However, the strong desire to bring back her long-lost daughter was more important than anything else. She said angrily, "Even the headmaster of the academy has to be reasonable. Besides, my daughter is just a little maidservant now. What can he say if we give him more money?" Zhang Jing shook his head slowly. As an important official of the imperial court, he was no stranger to the name of Ning Quebec. He first heard about the disturbance caused by the blooming flower invitation, and then the shock caused by the academy's ascension of the mountain. However, what the officials in the imperial court were most concerned about was this person's identity as the wayfarer of the academy. Ning Ke was the person who brought the academy into the human realm. Therefore, his opinion would be very important when it came to the succession of the Tang Empire's throne. Zhang Jing knew that this person had a close relationship with the princess. As a member of the Empress's faction, he was very worried that bringing back his long-lost daughter would affect the Empress's arrangements. However, it was not convenient for him to say these words to his wife. After a moment of silence, he said, "Go to the palace tomorrow and listen to the Empress's opinion." Mrs. Zhang had never been to school, and was not very knowledgeable among the first-ranked noblewomen in the imperial court. However, after the tragedy in her early years, she had been taught and nurtured by the Empress. She had already changed from a weak and incompetent concubine to an opinionated housewife. Hearing her master's words, she raised her eyebrows and said in a low voice, "No matter what the Empress says, I must bring back my daughter." Mr. 13 Ningke the Academy Y? In the depths of the Qing Palace, the golden bricks emitted a trace of warmth in the air. The Empress looked at the letter in her hand and muttered to herself. Her beautiful and slightly charming brows could not hide the confusion and vigilance. This letter came from the general's mansion in Tuyang City. In the letter, Xiaohou mentioned some of the recent events in Tuyang City. He also said that he had decided to resign from all the official positions in the army, and was ready to retire. He asked her to tell His Majesty his true intentions. Only a few people in the world knew the real relationship between the Empress of the Tang Empire and Xiaohou. The Empress was very clear about the stubborn and unyielding temperament of her brother who loved her dearly. What did the two people from the academy do in the wilderness in Tuyang City that made him so determined to admit defeat and retire? She was very willing to let her brother stay away from those bloody things. Retiring was also an excellent ending. She was very pleased after reading the letter, but the process of this matter was a little confusing to her. At this moment Mrs. Zhang arrived. After listening to Mrs. Zhang's tearful and smiling story about Sang Sang, the Empress was silent for a long time. Then a gentle smile appeared on her lips and she said, "This is a good thing. This is the 4th chapter. There is still one more chapter. Let me eat a bowl of noodles first." To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Qidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 340. In a side hall of the palace, Liu reclined on a soft couch and held a teacup with her fingers. She said mockingly, "When I'm tired, there's a pillow behind me. When I'm thirsty, there's a few cups of tea. It's naturally a good thing that things can be done." The little eunuch in front of her lowered his head and did not dare to reply. Liu was the biological daughter of the former empress. She grew up in the palace and was intelligent and well-behaved. She was favored by many people, and gained more respect from the people of the Tang Empire because of her marriage to the grassland. Many people in the imperial court thought highly of her, so no matter what happened inside or outside the palace, she was always the first to know. What else did the empress say? The little eunuch still did not dare to raise his head and reported softly, "Her Majesty said that she would support Mrs. Zeng to recognize her daughter. But since Sang Sang has served Ning Ke for so many years, she naturally has feelings for him. She asked the Grand Secretary's mansion not to be impulsive and break off this relationship." Hearing this, Li Yu frowned slightly, remembering the rift between her and the human world when she stood up by the bonfire at the entrance of Northern Mountain Road. She felt angry for no reason and said coldly, "It took me 2 years to build some affection with that pair of master and servant. You actually want to take it away from me just by recognizing me as your relative?" The little eunuch did not dare to get up. He knelt in front of the couch and repeatedly kowtowed. After a long silence, Li Yu asked, "Are you sure that Sang Sang is really the daughter of the Grand Secretary's mansion?" The little eunuch replied, looking at the expression of the Grand Secretary's wife, "It's 90% true. Do you have any proof?" "I don't know." Li Yu waved her hand to signal him to leave. She stayed in the hall and stared at the complicated and beautiful decorations on the beam for a long time. She was very clear that her previous anger came from her powerlessness, so she looked a little tired as she leaned on the couch. When she first invited Sang Sang to play in the Princess Mansion, Ning Ke was just a down-and-out scholar on Lin 47th Street. There were no utilitarian factors in their relationship. However, as Ning Ke gradually made a name for himself in Chang, and became the core disciple of the headmaster of the academy, he began to represent the academy to travel around the world. It could even be foreseen that he could influence the succession of the imperial power of the Tang Empire in the future. Li Yu felt that her response was correct. When she thought of her acquaintance with the little handmaiden, she felt that there was an invisible hand helping her and her brother. However, who would have thought that at this time, Sang Sang suddenly became Zeng Jing's daughter, and Zeng Jing became that woman's loyal dog. If Sang Sang was really the baby girl from the Grand Secretary's mansion, the blood relationship between her and Zeng Jing and his wife was more than just affection. With such an inseparable relationship, what would Ning Ke choose when the time came to fight for the throne in the future? Thinking of this, Li Yu felt a little lost. Her heart was filled with the frustration of being abandoned by Hao Yan in the old brush pen shop on Lin 47th Street. Back then, the steward who was hacked to pieces stole you out of the official of council's mansion and sold you to a human trafficker when old master was not paying attention. Now it seems that the human trafficker probably wanted to sell you outside the prefecture, but somehow he chose Hebei Prefecture. It was a drought, and he couldn't even take care of himself, so he left you in the wild. Mrs. Zeng looked at Sang Sang with tears in her eyes. She wanted to reach out and hold her little hand, but when she saw the big rag in her hand, she was worried that Sang Sang would not be willing. She could only nervously twist her fingers and look at Sang Sang expectantly. Sang Sang looked down at the toe of her cotton dress and said softly, "It seems to make sense." Mrs. Zeng hurriedly said, "Of course it makes sense. Child, do you believe that I am your mother now?" After a moment of silence, Sang Sang raised her head and asked seriously, "And then?" Mrs. Zeng was slightly startled and then said tenderly, "Of course, you will follow us back to the Grand Secretary's mansion. That is your real home. I have already ordered people to prepare your boudoir, and the maids have also been prepared. If you don't like the old ones in the mansion, I will ask the middlemen to bring the maids to the mansion tomorrow for you to choose." Sang Sang frowned slightly. She seemed indifferent because she did not know how to express her emotions at the moment. Grand Secretary Zeng Jing had been silently watching the scene of the mother and daughter reuniting. Although he was indeed quite happy, he was not as excited as his wife, since he had a child with his ex-wife. Especially when he looked at Song Song's slightly dark face, it was easy for him to recall the bloody day and the things that happened afterward. Although it was a blessing in disguise, he still did not like this memory. Moreover, as a high-ranking official of the Tang Empire, he had to pay attention to ethics and seniority. He was a little unhappy to see Sang Sang so indifferent in front of his wife. He said in an indisputable tone, "Go and pack your luggage. Forget it. I think there is nothing worth packing after all these years of wandering outside and suffering. Come back with us directly. As for the household registration, I will ask the Chong and local government to handle it. As for Ning Ke, I will ask the old chancellor to talk to him. There will be no problem." Sang Sang thought to herself, how could it not be worth packing after all these years of wandering outside and suffering? Then she lowered her head again and looked at the toe of her cotton dress in silence. Her slightly dark face showed that she did not know what to do, because she was really at a loss at the moment. Sang Sang had once imagined what kind of people her parents would be, but it was just a natural association after seeing other people's children have parents. She did not know whether it was because Ning Ke was too competent as a guardian, or because the little handmaiden had too few requirements for this world, but she had never envied others for having parents. The first person she saw when she opened her eyes in this world was Ning Quebec. She had been living with Ning Ke all these years. Could even be said that there was only Ning Ke in her life and no one else. She was not used to the existence of others, but today she found out that she had parents. According to the customs of the world, parents should be the closest people, even closer than Ning Quebec. Didn't that mean that Ning Ke had become someone else? Finding her biological parents should have been a very happy thing. However, when Sang Sang thought that her life with Ning Ke could no longer be the same as before, she did not know where the happiness went. On the contrary, she was not used to it and even had a strong sense of resistance, so she shook her head gently. Mrs. Zeng was slightly stunned and then understood what she meant. She could not believe her eyes. Zeng Jing's face suddenly became serious. He could not understand how someone would be so rebellious as to not recognize her parents. Mrs. Zeng saw his expression and knew that he was about to get angry. She hurriedly stood in front of him and smiled at Sang Sang. She said gently, I know this is too sudden and it is hard for you to accept it. Why don't you come back with us and we will recognize you as our adopted daughter? I believe that you will believe that I am your mother after a while. Sang Sang looked at her and suddenly smiled. She said, I know that you will treat me well. Mrs. Zeng's heart almost melted when she saw the sincere smile on her little face. She reached out and took the big rag that Sang Sang had been holding onto. She held Song Song's hand and said lovingly, Are you coming with us? Sang Sang still shook her head. Mrs. Zeng asked puzzledly why. Sang Sang said, Because the young master hasn't come back yet. When he comes back I will ask him what to do. If he thinks that you are really my parents, then I will naturally recognize you and visit you often. Mrs. Zeng heard something else in her words and repeated in surprise, Visit us often? Sang Sang said, Even if I recognize you, I still have to live in the shop. Mrs. Zeng asked in surprise why. Sang Sang looked at her and answered seriously, Ning Ke has become a lot lazier these years. There are many things that he is unwilling to do and probably won't do. That is why I have to cook, wash, mop the floor and wipe the table. Sometimes when the stewards come to steal waste paper, I have to chase them away with a broom. I really can't spend the night in the Grand Secretary's mansion. Zeng Jing and his wife were stunned. They could not understand why a little maidservant, who had been working so hard, did not throw herself into their arms in tears after learning that she was the daughter of the Grand Secretary and had become a phoenix. Instead, she was determined to stay in the evil master's house and take care of everything for the lazy young master. What kind of magic did that guy called Ning Ke cast to make his daughter say such things? Sang Sang continued, Besides, Ning Ke sometimes thinks too much and can't sleep well. He can only fall asleep when he hugs me. Sometimes when I feel too cold I like to hug him to sleep. That is why I can't sleep well when we are apart. Mrs. Zeng and Mrs. Zeng looked at each other and saw the shock and suspicion in each other's eyes. They wondered if something had happened between their daughter and Ning Ke over the years. But Sang Sang was still young and did not look like it. The door of the old brush pen shop was pushed open from the outside. Sang Sang knew when Ning Ke would come back, so she knew it was not him. Chun Pippi stepped over the threshold with difficulty and rubbed his tired round cheeks. He looked at the situation in the shop and said happily, Are you in trouble again? I was worried that those people would be scared by me. That would not be fun. Sang Sang explained, It's not trouble. You don't have to play. Chun Pippi said, Then let's play chess. Sang Sang smiled at Mrs. Zeng and Mrs. Zeng. Oh! Just when Mrs. Zeng left the old brush pen shop in a daze, a simple horse carriage drove into the east gate of Chang'an City. There were many girls around the horse carriage. It was Ning Ke and his people who had come back a few days earlier. Outside Tuyang City, their horse carriage met with the disciples of Black Ink Garden. Then they went south together. Today, these girls from the Great River Kingdom finally saw their famous city. Naturally, they could not help but be excited. A corner of the curtain of the carriage was lifted. Emo Shanshan, who was in a white dress, squinted at the scenery and people in Chang'an City. There was a faint smile on her slightly round and beautiful face. It could be seen that she was also very happy. Eldest brother rubbed his sore back and looked at Ning Kai, who was full of expectation and excitement. He asked with a bitter smile, "Youngest brother, why are you in such a hurry to return to Chang'an?" Ning Kai said seriously, "Senior brother, please don't make fun of me. Although I don't have the habit of choosing my bed, I can't sleep well when I leave home. So I'm in a hurry to go home and have a good sleep." Even if they were brothers of the same sect, they would still be afraid of being teased. So Ning Kai's words were not completely true. Only he himself knew the real reason why he couldn't sleep well and was in a hurry to return to Chang'an City. If he was not in the old brush pen shop, there would be no one to bring him water to wash his feet, no one to cook noodles with fried eggs, no one to hand him toothbrush, no one to laugh with him, no one to be sad with him. Without Sang Sang, he could not live without Sang Sang. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 341. The snow had not faded, and the cold wind was still blowing. It was not yet spring, but the streets of Chang'an had begun to emit the fragrance of spring. More than a dozen young girls' voices were like silver bells, and their faces were as pretty as flowers. They looked at the streets and pointed at them, attracting the attention of many passers-by. The girls wore light-colored cardigan dresses, with wide, long, and gorgeous belts tied high. Their style was very clear, and the well-informed people of Chang'an quickly guessed that they were from the Great River Kingdom. The Tang Empire and the Great River Kingdom had been on good terms for generations, and the people of the two countries had an innate sense of intimacy. However, due to the long distance between the two countries, the number of people from the Great River Kingdom in Chang'an had gradually decreased. Today, suddenly seeing so many beautiful girls from the Great River Kingdom and looking at their dresses, the older Tangs could not help but sigh. The old people began to recall the queen of the Great River Kingdom who came to Chang'an incognito to study in the Kaihua period, and began to tell the young people around them about the bitter love between the queen and the Tang emperor. The young Tangs were even more excited. They stood under the eaves of the street and waved to the girls from the Great River Kingdom, shouting that they were welcome to Chang'an. Some of the bolder ones even directly caught up with the team, running beside the girls' horses and asking for their names and addresses. Although the Great River Kingdom worshipped the Tang style, the girls in the country were known for their gentleness and chastity. After entering the city, the girls chattered about the osmanthus cake and the Wanyan temple. When they came to their senses, they felt that they had forgotten themselves and their faces were hot. Now being chased by the young Tangs and asked for their names, they were even more embarrassed and lowered their heads. Cat Girl looked at the young man who was panting and running beside the horses, and saw the undisguised love and excitement in his eyes. She shyly buried her little face in the fluffy collar and thought to herself, "I'm so young, why are you so anxious?" Emo Shanshan, who was a little uneasy, smiled at the warm welcome of the Chang'an people. She put down the curtain and began to close her eyes to rest. Her sparse and long eyelashes slightly blinked, as if the uneasiness in her heart had not completely disappeared. But why was she uneasy? Ning Kai came to her side, lifted the curtain and looked out. Most of the academy's students who were practicing at the frontier fortress returned to Chang'an City with him. The rapid march over the past few days had really tired these students, especially Zhong Dajuan, who was at the back. His face was pale and he was much thinner than before. Looking at his absent-minded look, it seemed that he could fall off the horse at any time. Ning Kai knew very well why. Back then, when he had disguised himself as Zhong Dajun and followed Emo Shanshan and the others into the wilderness, he had ordered someone to imprison Zhong Dajun. Later, when he revealed his true identity in the palace, he had forgotten about this matter. Therefore, Zhong Dajun was not released until he left Tuyang City. He must have suffered a lot in the past 6 months. Ning Kei's conduct was definitely not good, but he had absolutely no sense of guilt for Zhong Dajuan's absolutely bad conduct. He did not even bother to pay attention to him, and directly whistled to the front. Hearing the whistle, Situ Ilan gently lifted the reins and came to the carriage. In the past 6 months, she had led her classmates and soldiers to fight with the grassland barbarians and the coalition forces in the Blue Water Battalion. She had made a great name for herself in the army. However, her delicate face had been ravaged by wind and frost, and her head and face were covered with dust after traveling for thousands of miles. She inevitably looked a little embarrassed. Ning Kei looked at her and said, "Come to my house later. I'll treat you to noodles. When can you be more generous?" Situ Ilan snapped at him, and then pointed to her dusty face and said, "Although I don't care about these things on the battlefield, now that we've returned to Chang'an City, shouldn't you give me some time to freshen up? Don't forget that I'm a girl." Ning Kei pretended to be surprised and said, "I thought a female general was not a girl." Situ Ilan was about to punch him, which scared him so much that he hurriedly put down the curtain and hid behind Emo Shanshan. Emo Shanshan opened her eyes and looked at him with a slight smile, without saying anything. The imperial court naturally welcomed the practitioners of the academy back to the capital, especially the girls from the Black Ink Garden of the Great River Kingdom. Several officials from the Ministry of Rites also came. Ning Kei naturally did not have the patience to go through those procedures, so he asked for the opinions of eldest brother and Emo Shanshan. On the Vermilion Bird Avenue, the carriage separated from the main group and went directly to the eastern city. Not long after, they arrived at Lin 47th Street. Ning Kei jumped off the carriage and looked at the familiar street scene, the gray walls, and the winter trees sticking out of the former treasurer of the Ministry of Revenue's warehouse. He took a deep breath and felt very satisfied. Spring passed and winter returned. More than half a year had disappeared. He believed in the armchair, ink, well water, chicken soup, noodle slice soup, fried egg noodles, and the notes under the bed. Today he could finally embrace all these again, and it felt so good. Suddenly he saw a black carriage parked at the side of the shop. Looking at the dense fine lines on the carriage, he could not help but be silent for a moment. Then he nodded to the carriage and walked up the stone steps to open the door of the old brush pin shop. In the shop, Chun Pippi and Sang Sang had finished 3 games of chess and were eating noodles. Sang Sang was not a person who liked playing chess and gambling. However, since someone insisted on giving her money, she could not refuse his kindness and reluctantly played a few games with him. With the new notes with the smell of ink in her hands, she gradually forgot the loneliness and sadness brought by the departure of the 2 elders and the frustration brought by the Grand Secretary and his wife. Her mood became much better, so she made an exception and cooked 2 bowls of noodles for Chun Pippi and herself. At this moment the door of the shop was pushed open, making a soft squeak. Sang Sang held the bowl of noodles with her head down and sucked the noodles into her mouth. She thought that the bottom of the door hinge was a little deformed, and she had to find time to repair it. Suddenly, she felt that the footsteps of the person who came were a little strange and too familiar. She could not help but raise her head curiously. Seeing that guy, how could Sang Sang still remember to eat noodles? Su Rubai held the noodle beside her lips and smiled with her willowy eyes. She said with food in her mouth, "Ning Kei." Ning Kei looked at her with a smile. His eyes also squinted, like the crescent moon that did not exist in this world. Sang Sang suddenly found that there were other people behind Ning Quebec. There was a scholar and a girl in a white dress. The girl was very beautiful, especially her round face, which was very cute. Sang Sang suddenly woke up and knew that her mouth was full of noodles. Her face must be full, but it was not as beautiful as the girl in the white dress beside Ning Quebec. Therefore, she was a little flustered for no reason. She hurriedly put down the bowl and stood up. With 2 slurping sounds, she quickly sucked the noodles hanging by her mouth into her stomach. However, she was almost choked by the noodles. She coughed and said in a low voice, "Young master, you are back?" Then she looked down at the tips of her shoes and did not say anything. Emo Shanshan stood quietly beside Ning Kei, but a little behind him. She was invited to Chang, and by the eldest brother of the academy. She was a little happy, a little expectant, and a little uneasy. However, these emotions could not be seen on her calm face. She knew very well what she was uneasy about. Sometimes she even wondered whether she was looking forward to Chang, and because of Ning Ke or his little handmaiden. She followed Ning Ke into the old brush pin shop, and saw the little handmaiden sitting on a small stool eating noodles. From the first time she saw her, she knew that it was the person she wanted to see. The little handmaiden was Sang Sang. The Sang Sang at the beginning of the chicken soup calligraphy. The Sang Sang that Ning Ke always talked about. Mo Shanshan had read the chicken soup calligraphy countless times in the summer night by the ink lake. She knew better than anyone, even Ning Ke himself, how much absolute trust and intimacy were hidden between the messy strokes of the handmaiden's name at the beginning of the chicken soup calligraphy. Therefore, she had always wanted to know what kind of little handmaiden Sang Sang was. In the palace of the grassland, she said that she liked Ning Ke's big black horse. In the snowfield, she said that she liked Ning Ke's calligraphy. At the moment when the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine was about to die, she finally calmly said that she liked Ning Ke's horse and calligraphy, as well as Ning Ke himself. At that time she thought she would die, so she said it according to her heart. However, she did not die, and she could not go back on her words. Therefore, she was sure that she liked Sang Sang, so she wanted to see Sang Sang even more. Today she finally saw Sang Sang, but she was a little surprised. Because Sang Sang was not a common pretty handmaiden in the world. She was just a dark-skinned, thin and ordinary girl. She was still very young, and her eyebrows had not fully developed. Especially when she held a big bowl of noodles with the noodles in her mouth and eyes smiling, she could not have any other feelings except for pity. Facing such a little handmaiden, Mo Shanshan felt that what she had guessed and imagined in the past, including the nervousness before they arrived in Chang'an, were very excessive. Therefore, she felt a little ashamed. After staring at her for a moment, she silently lowered her head and looked at the toes of her shoes sticking out of her skirt, not saying a word. Sang Sang looked down at the shoes sticking out of her cotton skirt, and Shanshan looked down at the shoes sticking out of her white skirt. The scene was a little funny, and the atmosphere in the old brush pen shop became a little strange. Ning Ke was still immersed in the joy of seeing Sang Sang again, and did not notice anything at all. As for eldest brother, he was looking at the furnishings in the shop with his hands clasped behind his back. It seemed that he did not notice anything, but in fact, he sighed softly in his heart. Sang Sang suddenly came to her senses and hurriedly said, "Guests have come. I'll go make some tea." She bowed to everyone, and then picked up her bowl of noodles on the table. She snatched another bowl from Chan Pippi, who was also in a state of shock, and hurried back to the backyard. Ning Ke looked at her thin back disappearing behind the curtain, a little surprised. Although she looked as busy as usual after not seeing her for a long time, why didn't she come to hug him after such a long time? Whether his mouth was stuffed with noodles or not, Chan Pippi's cheeks were very round and bulging, much rounder than Mo Shanshan's. He came to his senses when the bowl in his hand was snatched away by Sang Sang like a gust of wind. He looked at the scholar with his hands clasped behind his back, and hurriedly sucked the noodles into his stomach. He jumped behind the scholar, bowed deeply, and said respectfully, "Greetings, eldest brother." Eldest brother turned around and looked at him pretending to be serious. He could not help shaking his head with a smile and said slowly, "Pippi, now you are no longer the youngest brother in the back mountain. Your words and actions." Before he finished speaking, Chan Pippi opened his arms and held him in his arms. He said happily and indignantly, "Senior brother, you are finally back. I don't know where the headmaster is playing. No one in the back mountain can control second brother. He is tyrannical in the mountain and forced us to learn some ancient etiquette. Senior brothers and sisters are angry, but dare not say anything. 11th brother is almost driven crazy by him, and he stuffs flowers into his mouth. You have to help us. The next chapter may be a little later. I am a little tired. Thank you for your support. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 342. Ning Ke heard two key points from Chan Pippi's words. First, he said that the headmaster had died somewhere. Secondly, He said that second brother was overbearing and the other senior brothers and sisters dared not to say anything even though they were angry. Then he saw Chan Pippi holding eldest brother in his arms as if he was a treasure. Chan Pippi's fat face was full of expectation and ecstasy, but there was no sense of respect or distance. Then he understood two things. Firstly, neither the headmaster of the academy nor the eldest brother cared much about the academy's back of the mountain, nor did they care about the expressions and attitudes of others. That was why Chan Pippi spoke without restraint and behaved without a sense of distance. The one who was truly terrifying or worthy of respect was the unsmiling second brother. Second, Chan Pippi was really a master of lying. Chan Pippi did not know that Ning Ke was criticizing him. He wiped away the snot and tears on his face and held Ning Ke in his arms. He patted Ning Ke heavily and said, "Youngest brother, you have worked hard. This girl is really beautiful." Ning Ke pushed him away rudely and looked back at Mo Shanshan. He could not help but feel embarrassed. He thought that it was not reasonable to praise someone's beauty at the first meeting. This guy really disgraced the academy's back of the mountain. Chan Pippi was not really lustful. In fact, his understanding of the affairs between men and women was even weaker than Ning Ke's. Otherwise, he would not have been beaten up so badly by Yi Hongyu, and he would not have expressed his hatred for women in his first letter to Ning Quebec. Therefore, he only thought that Mo Shanshan was beautiful and had no other thoughts. Ning Ke introduced, "This girl is Mo Shanshan from the Great River Kingdom. She is the last disciple of the master of calligrapher, Lord Wang." Chan Pippi was slightly stunned and asked incredulously, "You are the calligraphy addict?" Through the conversation between the academy's brothers, Mo Shanshan had already confirmed that this person was the legendary youngest powerhouse in the Knowing Destiny state. She was a little surprised and looked at him and nodded. Chan Pippi sucked in a mouthful of cold air and said with a sigh, "No wonder you're so beautiful. But since you and that woman are known as the three addicts of the world, I'd better not provoke you. Do you know that I am a genius among the geniuses in cultivation, the kind of genius to the extreme?" Ning Ke explained helplessly, "Shanshan's eyes are not good. Don't misunderstand." Chan Pippi was stunned and said shamelessly, "Anyway, I don't like people who are similar to Tao addict." Ning Ke ignored him and asked, "Why are you here?" Chan Pippi said, "Ask Sang Sang yourself." At this time, eldest brother finished his inspection of the old brush pen shop. He looked at them and said slowly, "Didn't youngest brother invite us to dinner? When will it start? I'm a little hungry." As soon as he returned to Chang'an, Ning Ke invited eldest brother and Shanshan to the old brush pen shop as guests. He really wanted to thank them for taking care of him along the way, so he wanted them to get in touch with him and enter his real life. Life seemed to be simple and ordinary, but in fact many of the conversations in the old brush pen shop today were not simple. Eldest brother and Chan Pippi had vaguely revealed some information, but they did not know each other's insistence and judgment, not to mention Ning Ke and the two girls who were involved in the conversation. Perhaps it was because of this that the first formal dinner of the old brush pen shop ended in vain. Sang Sang dawdled in the backyard for a long time. Before the tea was served, eldest brother and the other two left. The Black Ink Garden girls of the Great River Kingdom lived in the VIP department of the Ministry of Rights, and Mo Shanshan was going to meet her fellow disciples there. In Chan Pippi's words, the headmaster of the academy was still playing outside, so eldest brother naturally had to go back to the back of the mountain of the academy to deal with the affairs in the academy. Chan Pippi also left with eldest brother. So when the door of the shop was closed with a slight squeak, the old brush pen shop became a world of Ning Ke and Sang Sang again, quiet and peaceful. Sang Sang steamed a bowl of rice, cooked a bowl of pickled radish and sour bamboo shoots with bacon, and fried a plate of home-cooked vegetables. This was the first meal Ning Ke had after returning to Chang'an. The charcoal basin in the shop was very warm. Ning Ke took off his coat and sat at the table to eat quietly. Sang Sang sat at the other side of the table and ate quietly. From time to time she would fill a bowl of rice or a bowl of soup for him. No one spoke. After picking up Sang Sang from the pile of corpses by the roadside, the 6 months in the wilderness was the longest separation between the two of them. No matter how long the separation was, it would not make them feel strange to each other. However, Ning Ke always felt a little uncomfortable, especially when he saw Sang Sang gradually growing up. He found that this girl had clearly grown up a lot. After the meal, Sang Sang did not wash the dishes, but began to tell him a story. That day, the old man came into the shop wearing a dirty coat. He said that there was a lucky chance between us and he wanted to take me as his disciple. At that time I thought that he was already so old and could not eat too much, so I took him in. The story was a little long. Song Song's words were concise enough, and it took a long time. During the process, Ning Ke remained silent. He did not ask any questions, nor did he take a sip of the tea at hand. Finally, the story came to the last part. Sang Sang took him to the courtyard, pointed to the 2 urns under the wall, and said, "The one sleeping in the new urn is my teacher, and the one sleeping in the old urn is your teacher." Then she went into the bedroom, fumbled on the bed for a long time, and took out 2 things from a secret place. She handed one of them to him and said, "This is left by Master Yen Sei for you. It seems to be very important and many people are looking for it." She raised the seemingly ordinary waist token in her hand and said, "This is left by my teacher." In his words, "This is the waist token of the West Hill Divine Palace's great divine priest of light. If I want to sit on the divine throne in the future, I need to wear this token on my waist." Ning Ke looked at the waist token and thought of the 2 bloody cases many years ago. He frowned slightly and felt a little disgusted. Sang Sang looked at him and said after a moment of silence, "The bloody case in the Xianwei General's mansion should be planned by my teacher." He said it was because he once saw a person in the general's mansion who was born with knowledge. "Young master, it was you, right?" Ning Ke nodded. Since he was a child, he had never mentioned to Sang Sang about the blood feud he carried, because he felt that these things had nothing to do with her, and there was no need for her to become indifferent like him. However, he did not deliberately hide anything from her. After so many years, he naturally knew some things that he should know. Sang Sang looked into his eyes and said seriously, "The dark shadow that my teacher is looking for is actually the legendary son of Yama. If he is looking for you, then you are the son of Yama." Although Ning Ke came from another world and his background could be said to be bizarre, he had never associated himself with the legendary great existence, let alone Yama. After hearing this, he was only startled and said sarcastically, "Although in a sense I have seen Yama once, I know better than anyone that I am definitely not the son of Yama. Your teacher is not only a lunatic, but also an idiot." Sang Sang said, "But there are many people who will believe in my teacher, so we must not let others know about this." Ning Ke thought for a long time and then smiled bitterly. He said with emotion, "You are right. Except for the 2 of us, no one else can know about this, just like the box of notes under the bed." Sang Sang suddenly looked down at the tip of her shoes and said softly, "There is one more thing. Let's talk about it later." Ning Ke looked up at the sky and walked to the wall to pick up the old urn. He said, "I want to bury my teacher first." Sang Sang pointed to the new urn and said, "There is one more." Ning Ke looked at the new urn and frowned slightly. He said indifferently, "This person killed my whole family, Darky's whole village and my teacher. I have fulfilled the Academy's teaching of forgiveness by not smashing this urn." After saying this, he left the courtyard with the old urn and walked to the shop. Sang Sang stood there and thought for a while. Then she walked to the wall and picked up the new urn. The simple horse carriage outside the old brush pen shop was taken back to the academy by eldest brother, as well as the black horse carriage. The big black horse was kicking its hooves in front of the black horse carriage. Ning Ke walked to the side of the carriage and slowly stroked the wall of the carriage. The wall was made of pure steel and cast iron, showing a unique coldness of metal. Those deep and complicated talisman lines seemed to still have the aura of Master Yen Sei. He sat in the carriage with the new urn. After a while, Sang Sang held the old urn and also climbed up, panting. Ning Ke looked down at the old urn and said to the big black horse, "Go to the south of the city." The big black horse seemed to understand human language. The black carriage moved slowly. The wheels rolled over the bluestone slabs, making a fine and clear sound. It was quiet in the carriage. The master and the handmaiden held their teacher's urn and kept silent. After a long time, Ning Ke suddenly looked up at her and said, "Come here." Sang Sang was very happy. She held the new urn and was ready to go. Ning Ke looked at the new urn in her arms and frowned. He said, "Come here. Put the urn over there." Sang Sang looked down at the new urn and looked up at the empty seat next to Ning Quebec. She carefully put the new urn against the seat, walked to the opposite side and sat down beside Ning Quebec. Ning Ke put the old urn at his feet and held her in his arms. They did not speak along the way. Only the sound of the carriage accompanied them. Sang Sang leaned in his arms peacefully. But she looked at the opposite side from time to time, worried that the new urn would fall and her teacher would come out. South of Chang'an, there was a meadow not far from the academy. This meadow belonged to the academy, but few people took care of it. So even in the middle of winter, one could still see knee-high withered weeds and corpses. 2 new graves were erected in the depths of the withered weeds. Ning Ke kowtowed heavily in front of one grave twice. He stood up and looked at the other new grave a few steps away. He said with an ugly expression, "I told you to bury them further away. Why didn't you listen to me?" Sang Sang ignored him and knelt in front of the new grave. She imitated him and kowtowed 3 times. Ning Ke said helplessly, "Now you don't even listen to me." Sang Sang stood up and looked at him. She said, "They're dead. Why did you bury them so far away?" When they picked the urns, they said that they could be neighbors after they were buried side by side. Ning Ke looked at the 2 new graves in front of him and was silent for a long time. Then he scolded angrily, "They're dead. How can they be neighbors? They've turned into 2 piles of ashes. Do they still want to talk and fight? What 2 idiots?" To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 343. The big black horse was eating grass with its head lowered. The withered grass in the middle of winter was tasteless and tasteless. The more it chewed, the more bitter it tasted, like tree bark. Spat it out painfully. It looked up at the 2 new graves in the depths of the meadow. Looking at the little handmaiden, it thought to itself that the 2 of them could become its mistresses. The one who bathed it in the wilderness was better. The one who bathed it in the wilderness was too dark and skinny. The other one was fair and beautiful, and her hands were quite gentle. Thinking of these things, it walked out of the meadow. When it saw the black carriage, its body suddenly stiffened. How could there be such a heavy carriage in this world? Ever since Ning Ke saw her in the meadow that spring, she had been living a miserable life. Could it be that seeing Ning Ke had ruined her whole life? In front of the new grave, Sang Sang lowered her body and brushed off the dirt on her knees. She walked to Ning Ke and cleaned his clothes. At this moment, the sky suddenly started to snow. With a soft bang, the big black umbrella opened above their heads, covering the sky and the snow that squeezed out of the clouds. The master and the servant held the black umbrella and walked toward the carriage outside the meadow. Under the big black umbrella, Sang Sang lowered her head and said softly, "Young master, I really have something to tell you. Don't panic." Ning Ke thought of something and took out a small box from his arms. "I spent half a month in Tuyang City and carefully picked out a gift for you. Do you like it?" In fact, when he left Tuyang City on New Year's Day, he bought this box from a shop on the street. He didn't spend half a month on it, nor did he choose it carefully. However, his expression was very serious, and no one could see any flaws in it. Sang Sang curiously took the box and opened it to find a cute little clay tiger inside. The little clay tiger in the box turned its body sideways, looking charmingly naive. She looked at it and smiled, saying, "I like it. It's pretty." Ning Ke said shamelessly, "Of course. Think about how much energy I spent on it." Sang Sang closed the box and asked, "Who's the pretty lady in the white dress?" This question came too naturally, so it was very sudden. Ning Ke was startled and then said with a smile, "Her name is Emo Shanshan. She is from the Great River Kingdom." Lin 47th Street was very quiet at night, except for the crackling of the braziers in the houses, the soft sound of withered leaves falling on the winter snow, and the special sound of the big black horse's lips. After washing himself from head to toe, Ning Ke leaned comfortably on the North Kong. He took out a waste fire talisman that he had not completely failed in the past and crushed it with his fingers. Then he rubbed it evenly on his head with both hands and began to rub it. After a while, the remaining warmth in the talisman paper dried his wet hair, making it smooth and black. Get ready for bed. He happily crawled into the warm quilt and felt the comfortable temperature from the Kong bed. Suddenly, he found Sang Sang kneeling on the bed to make the quilt. He couldn't help asking, "Why did you come to sleep with me?" Sang Sang laid out the bedding, took off her coat and folded it beside the pillow. She said, "I'm a grown-up now, of course I have to sleep in separate beds." Ning Ke was startled and found that this sentence was very reasonable, but he still felt a little unaccustomed. He thought silently for a while, then stretched his hand out of the quilt and flicked his index finger. The candle on the table was extinguished. Then let's sleep. It was quiet in the room. After a while there was a sudden rustling sound. Then, his quilt was lifted and a small and slightly cold body crawled in and quietly leaned on his chest. Ning Ke held her and gently patted her back, just like when he coaxed her to sleep when she was a child. He felt the little girl's body in his arms and smelled the scent of her hair coming from his neck. He sighed and said, "It's still so comfortable." Sang Sang nuzzled her head in his arms, looking for the most familiar and comfortable position, and gently responded with After a long time, she suddenly opened her eyes and looked up at Ning Quebec. She said, "I really have something to say." Ning Ke looked down at her and said after a moment of silence, "I do have something important to tell you." He did not relight the candle. Instead, he took out a heavy ingot of snowflake silver from the corner of the wall and asked Sang Sang to focus on it. Ning Ke moved the Great Spirit in his body to his hands and rubbed the ingot of snowflake silver into a silver rod. Then, he pinched it quickly with his fingers and the tip of the silver rod became extremely sharp. Sang Sang knelt on the brick bed with the quilt on her shoulder and asked confusedly, "When did you learn to juggle?" Ning Ke stabbed the sharp silver rod into his arm. The sharp tip sank deep into his arm but only left a very shallow white mark. Not a single drop of blood seeped out. Sang Sang was very surprised. She poked his arm with her finger and said, "So hard. I learned the Great Spirit left by youngest uncle. It was this Great Spirit that made my body like this." The so-called Great Spirit is to absorb the primordial chi of heaven and earth and store it in one's body. Ning Ke looked at the reflection of starlight in her eyes and said after a long silence, "In other words, the cultivation method I am cultivating now is the cultivation method of the Devil's Doctrine. To this world, I am a remnant of the Devil's Doctrine." Even if he was the son of Yama, it did not affect Sang Sang at all, not to mention the remnant of the Devil's Doctrine. Was a young master who cultivated the cultivation method of the Devil's Doctrine not a young master? Sang Sang was stunned for a while, and thought of another very important question. She said, "Well then what the teacher said might be true. You are the son of Yama." *T. Ning Ke secretly moved his chi and kneaded the silver rod into a silver ball. He shook the quilt and covered the two of them. He said, "Don't mention those *T things. I want to eat fried egg noodles tomorrow." Sang Sang hummed in the quilt and said, "Got it." The next morning, Ning Ke went to the academy after eating a bowl of fried egg noodles with scallions, pepper and eggs. Master Yen Se gave him the horse carriage as a great inheritance, so he naturally took it. The original horse carriage had been paid off. The horse carriage passed through the yellow meadow in the winter morning light and came to the stone gate of the academy. Ning Ke jumped off the carriage and untied the big black horse to let it play by itself. He carried his luggage and walked into the academy. He found the instructor and told some things about the frontier fortress practice. Then, carrying his heavy luggage, he walked past the houses, past the narrow alleys and walked to the wetland. He looked at the fish swimming listlessly between the thin ice, and then looked at the dense forest in the distance. Finally, he came to the front of the old academy. It was all very familiar scenery and he had a lot of good memories. Although he had not seen it for only half a year, he already missed it very much. The more he missed Chang'an, the less he believed in the city of Wei. Looking up at the open east window of the old library, Ning Ke suddenly understood one thing. The place he missed the most was probably his hometown. He walked through the fog that shrouded the mountain and waved his right hand to drive away the last wisp of fog. Then he came to the wide cliff yard on the mountainside. Looking at the grass, flowers and trees that were completely out of season and the silver waterfall falling from the top of the cliff in the distance, he could not help but feel refreshed and shouted, "I'm back." His shout echoed in the empty back mountain of the academy. After a long time, there was no response except his voice, and no senior brother or sister came out to welcome him. Ninkei could not help but feel a little resentful. He walked along the mountain path to the mirror lake, and then the expression on his face became happier and happier. Although there were still no senior brothers or sisters appearing, he heard someone playing the zither and singing in the forest beside the path. There was a crisp sound of chess pieces falling on the board and the sound of hoes digging into the soil. It must be the burial of flowers. There was a water wheel beside the stream, and the sound of iron forging could still be heard in the house in front of the water wheel. The monotonous and boring sound seemed to have never stopped. Ninkei was refreshed. He weighed the luggage behind him and quickened his pace. However, halfway there, he was stopped by someone. He looked towards the direction of the voice and saw that the pavilion that had been destroyed by the first primordial 13 arrows in the center of the mirror-like lake had already been repaired. Seventh sister looked at him and covered her mouth with a smile. She waved her hand as a greeting. After a while, second brother, who looked serious, slowly walked out with his high hat. "You did a good job in practice this time." Standing by the lake, second brother said slowly with his hands behind his back, looking at the lake and mountains. His tone was calm and unquestionable. In the back mountain of the academy, it was much more difficult to get praise or affirmation from second brother than from the headmaster of academy or eldest brother. Therefore, Ninkei felt a little flattered and did not know what to say. It's not a big deal to kill Long Qing. Senior brothers and sisters spent so much effort to make the primordial 13 arrows for you to shoot that guy. Therefore, it's a matter of course and not worth praising. Second brother looked back at him with a rare hint of praise on his face. He said, "But killing Gushi in Tuyang City, you did a good job. Regardless of whether Xiaohou was in the city or whether it was the headquarters of the Northeast Border Military, you killed him as long as it was reasonable. You should know that the disciples of the academy pay attention to reason." The reason why Ninkei killed the military counselor Gu Shi in Tuyang City that day was largely due to the abrupt choice made by the state of the Great Spirit in his body. In hindsight, it did seem a little crazy. On the way back to Chang'an, he had been worried whether eldest brother would teach him a lesson because of this matter. He did not expect that second brother would think so. Second brother seemed to have guessed what he was thinking. After a moment of silence, he said slowly, "I have always respected eldest brother, but I respect his cultivation, state of mind, and even his virtue. As for the way of forgiveness and the way of life that he believes in, I have a different view from him. If we really repay evil with good, then what do we use to repay good?" Hearing this, Ninkei thought for a while and asked seriously, "Then how do we repay evil?" Second brother said, "Of course we repay evil with good." Ninkei praised, "Senior brother's words are simple but not simple. There is great meaning in the subtlety." Second brother looked at him and said, "This is what our teacher taught us years ago, so you have praised the wrong person." "Thank you. I will continue to work hard." This is the first chapter. The next chapter will be around 6 o'clock. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for it. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 344. In Chang'an, handmaiden Sang only had two friends she could talk to. One was Li Yu, the princess of the Tang Empire, and the other was Xiao, Mistress Jian's personal handmaiden. The status of the princess of the Tang Empire and the handmaidens of the brothel were worlds apart. However, Song's attitude towards them was the same. She was always silent and played the role of a listener. Xiao gently patted the railing twice, looked at Sang beside her, and asked curiously, "I've heard of the calligraphy addict. I think she's one of the 3 addicts in the world. Since I've heard of her, she must be very famous. Is she beautiful?" Sang nodded. Xiao angrily said, "Men are really bad." Sang Sang looked at her in confusion. Xiao Qiao emphasized and explained, I mean your young master. Sang Sang was even more confused. Xiao Qiao looked at her and said anxiously, now everyone in Chang and knows that Ning Ke brought back a beautiful woman from a long journey. Aren't you worried at all? Sang Sang looked at her and asked seriously, what should I worry about? Xiao Qiao held her hand and said worriedly, according to what you usually say, you often sleep with your young master, so it's definitely impossible for you to marry someone else. In the future, you will definitely become his concubine. In the end, he didn't even tell you before bringing a woman home. It seems that he doesn't have any feelings for you. In the future, if that woman marries your young master and becomes the mistress of the household, what will you do? Sang Sang looked down at her hands that were tightly holding the railing. After a long silence, she said softly, young master is getting old and needs to get married. When I first came to your brothel with him, we had been discussing who is suitable to be the mistress. So even if he wants to marry Miss Calligraphy Addict, I won't feel anything. You want them dead? Which part of them are you thinking about? Or do you want them dead? After struggling in the wilderness for more than half a year, you come to the brothel instead of studying in the academy after returning to Chang, and I really don't know how the headmaster and eldest brother have taught you. Are you really going to live in the mortal world for the rest of your life? Mistress Jian stared at Ning Ke in front of her with dissatisfaction written all over her broad forehead. Ning Ke stood there obediently and did not dare to argue. The woman in front of him was not an ordinary woman. Not to mention that she controlled the rules of the brothel in Chang and, which was equivalent to controlling his sexual happiness, he did not dare to be the slightest bit presumptuous because of the vague relationship between her, youngest uncle, and the academy. After the trip to the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine and listening to Lian Shang's memories, he was sure that the girl named Xiao Xiao who died tragically in front of the Lang Temple had something to do with the House of Red Sleeves. Youngest uncle had destroyed the Devil's Doctrine because of the girl's death. Second brother had said that youngest uncle and Aunt Jian were close. What had happened between them? He could have asked Mistress Jian about the girl named Xiao Xiao, but he thought that it was a sad story of the past. He didn't want to make the elders sad again, so he didn't mention it. He suddenly thought that Aunt Jian should be very interested in the news of youngest uncle, so he said, I have inherited youngest uncle's legacy. Mistress Jian was slightly startled and asked in a trembling voice, Howren sword? Ning Ke nodded and answered yes. Mistress Jian looked at him in disbelief and then frowned deeply. She leaned forward slightly and stared into his eyes. She asked very seriously, only the Howren sword? Ning Ke was startled and then nodded again. Mistress Jian suddenly felt relaxed when she got his confirmation. She leaned back tiredly and said, that's good. Ning Ke looked at her expression and thought that maybe Aunt Jian also knew the truth of youngest uncle's joining the devil. I don't want you to follow his old path. Mistress Jian looked at him and said earnestly, if you want the world to admit that you are qualified to represent the academy and enter the human realm, you have to go through a lot of training. When he entered Chang and on a little black donkey, he was just a little scholar in a green robe. But because he couldn't control his mind, he caused a lot of trouble in the world and finally died without a burial place. So you must remember to keep a low profile this time and don't offend too many people. This was the second time that Ning Ke heard Mistress Jian seriously mention the word, enter the human realm, in today's conversation. He couldn't help but feel confused and wondered what it was. Then he heard that she used youngest uncle to warn him, so he couldn't help but smile and replied, don't worry, I'm not as strong as youngest uncle. If there is any trouble, I can just hide in the academy. Don't think that the academy is really the best in the world. If the academy can really solve everything in the world, how could your youngest uncle end up like that? What's the point of cutting all the peach blossoms on the mountain afterward? Mistress Jian said coldly, and the wrinkles at the corner of her eyes were full of resentment. That was resentment against the academy, and even against the headmaster of the academy. According to the law of the Tang Empire, students of the academy were not allowed to join the army after graduation. Therefore, unlike most of the officials in the imperial court who came from the academy and had a close relationship with the academy, the military of the Tang Empire had always been estranged from the academy. Especially recently, the powerful figures in the military, represented by the Defender General of the state Su Shi, had even developed a strong vigilance against the academy, especially those super-mundane people in the back of the mountain of the academy. What made this vigilance a reality was a memorial from Tuyang City. In the memorial, the Defender General of the military Xia Ho, who had made great achievements in the war, earnestly requested to retire. His words were full of fatigue and discouragement. After seeing this memorial, many generals in the military ministry felt sad, especially the bigwigs at the top. They knew that before Xia Ho decided to retire, Mr. First and Mr. 13 of the academy went to Tuyang City and had a long talk with Xia Ho in the winter courtyard. Therefore, they became even angrier. Many people in the military of the Tang Empire did not like Xia Ho, but they insisted that it was the military's own problem. Even if Xia Ho was to be punished, it should be handled by His Majesty or the imperial court, and not by the academy. As for Xia Ho being a visiting professor of the West Hill Divine Palace, it was not a big deal in the eyes of the Tangs, who were also believers of Haotian. Of course, no one dared to suspect the headmaster of the academy. It was just that the headmaster of the academy had not appeared in the human world for many years, and even His Majesty had not seen him for a long time. Therefore, the military thought that it was the fault of the back of the mountain of the academy. I believe that if the headmaster of the academy knew about this, he would not allow those people in the back of the mountain to act so unscrupulously. Su Shi said coldly, "Cultivators should cultivate and not interfere with the politics of the court. Just like the two unknown places, deep in the mountains or the wilderness, those outside the world return to the outside world, and those inside the world return to the inside world. Why should they be connected? Why should they enter the human world? How is the investigation of that case?" he asked. There is indeed an iron nail in the head of censor Zhang Yiqi. The Chang and local government protected the evidence well, but they did not continue the investigation at that time. When Xianwei General Chen Zixin died in the iron shop, the old brush pen shop was not open that day. In the early morning after the death of the former military ministry document appraiser Yan Suqing, the Yulin Royal Guards found a piece of cloth deliberately left by the murderer and found a coat in another yard. Because it was a ready-made garment from the lawn embroidery workshop, this clue could not be traced. However, according to the investigation of the murder scene and the wound on the coat, it can be confirmed that the murderer was seriously injured. A military ministry official said, 2 days after Yan Suqing's death, it was the semester examination of the academy. According to the student's memory, Ning Ke had made an appointment with Xie Chengyan, a scholar of the South Jin Kingdom, to bet on the result of the examination. However, he asked for 2 consecutive days of leave at that time. This matter caused an uproar in the academy, so it could not be faked. Su Shi said coldly, of course he had to ask for leave when he was seriously injured. The military of the Tang Empire was extremely powerful. Once they started a comprehensive investigation of something, they would instantly show extremely strong action and high efficiency. It did not take them a long time to find out so many clues, which was really terrifying. These seemingly inconspicuous clues were like a net, faintly pointing to a vague figure. It seemed to indicate that Ning Ke, a student of the second floor of the academy, had something to do with those murder cases. Nothing can stand up to suspicion because once you start to suspect, you can seek evidence. As long as you seek evidence, you can find a lot of evidence. Otherwise, who would believe that the core disciple of the headmaster of the academy turned out to be a cold-blooded murderer? Su Shi said expressionlessly, I don't want to know the connection behind these murder cases. I don't want to know who Ning Ke was and what kind of hatred he had with the deceased. I just want to confirm that he did not violate the law of the Tang Empire. After thinking for a moment, the official shook his head and said, the existing evidence is not enough to prove anything. Su Shi frowned slightly and seemed to be a little worried. The official looked at him in confusion and asked in a low voice, actually, even if we really find evidence of Ning Ke's involvement in the case, can we really go to the back of the mountain of the academy to arrest him for trial? General, in my humble opinion, let's just forget about this matter. Su Shi looked at the winter sun outside the window and said slowly, the headmaster of the academy once said that the law of the Tang Empire is the most important. Our Tang Empire is strong and prosperous according to this principle. If the academy breaks the law, it will be the same as the common people. Even if we can't find evidence of Ningke violating the law of the Tang Empire, we have to let the headmaster of the academy know about this matter, and make Ningke unable to be the wayfarer of the academy. After a moment of silence, he said coldly, "Now it seems that my vigilance towards Ningke is indeed right. If the future nation master is such a villain, how can the Tang Empire be at peace? If those foreign cultivators have already entered Chong, tell them to provide convenience for them. Tell the Yulin royal guards not to easily try to stop the battle between the two sides." The official from the military ministry trembled slightly and expressed his opposition without hesitation. He said, "I object. Even if Ningke is a villain, he is after all a Tang man. How can we deal with him by using the hands of foreign people?" Su Shi turned around and looked at him with slight mockery. He said, "Do you think I am such a shameless fool?" The official from the military ministry was fearless and replied, "I dare not, so I don't understand the meaning of your words. Since we are going to enter the human realm, we have to be tempered. Hu Haoran was like this in the past, and Ningke is the same now. I just want this kind of tempering to be fairer. I believe the academy will not have any objection to my arrangement." Su Shi said coldly, "If Ningke is guilty, of course he should be punished by the law of the Tang Empire. But now there is no evidence that he has violated the law of the Tang Empire. So I really want him to lose again and again, until he finally loses all his courage and edges." To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 345. Ningke did not know that he had become the hero in the novel, and was about to face the challenges of countless supporting roles. He would either win or lose and finally decide whether he was the hero or not, like Long Qing, who was supposed to be the hero but ended up as a side character. After returning to Chong, and from the wilderness, he had been thinking about an important problem. If he could not solve that problem, he would not even dare to cultivate in the back of the mountain of the academy, let alone fight with others. In order to solve this important problem, early the next morning, or to be exact, when it was still dark, he used the waste token of the visiting professor of the Imperial Center Administration to leave Chong, and he came to the mountain road behind the old library of the academy and waited quietly. At the moment when the morning light appeared in the east, the clouds on the mountain road gradually dispersed. Eldest brother, who was wearing an old coat and straw sandals, slowly walked out. He was surprised to see Ningke, who was leaning against the tree and yawning. Ningke bowed and asked, "Senior brother, where are you going today?" Eldest brother smiled and said, "I have been traveling with my teacher for the past 2 years, and did not know that the imperial court had dredged a large lake under the Yanming mountain in the south of Chong, and I went there yesterday. The air in the lake was fresh and the water under the ice was clear. There were also fishermen breaking the ice to catch fish. I like it very much, so I am going to see it again today." Ningke had a lot of experience in dealing with eldest brother's speaking speed and verbosity. His ears could automatically filter out the nonsense about scenery and mood, and capture the only useful words. However, he did not find any key point in eldest brother's words. He said angrily, "Senior brother, I have a question to ask you." Eldest brother was slightly startled and asked, "Is it very troublesome? I still want to see the lake. How about another day?" Ningke said firmly, "Not another day. Can only be today." "Is it long?" "It can be long or short." Youngest brother, "If it is a riddle, then it is not interesting." Eldest brother, "Am I such a boring person?" After a short conversation, eldest brother and youngest brother began to climb the long mountain road. "This important question is, I wanted to ask you when we were roasting potatoes by the bonfire in the wilderness, but you said not to. You will ask the headmaster of the academy when you return, but the headmaster of the academy has not returned. Why do I feel that this sentence is also a riddle?" Ningke stopped in front of the winter trees that had stabbed him all over. After a long silence, he looked at eldest brother and nodded. He said as calmly as possible, I have inherited youngest uncle's mantle at the front gate of the devil's doctrine. In Lotus's words, I have joined the devil, and I am sure that there is something wrong with my body. A gust of winter wind blew past. Eldest brother looked at a ginkgo leaf on the mountain path, which was twisting in the wind. After a long silence, he withdrew his gaze and nodded at him. He smiled and said, I know. Ninkei looked at his eyes nervously and waited for what would happen next. However, eldest brother did not do or say anything. He just smiled and shook his head, and then continued to walk up the mountain path. You knew I was possessed by the devil, and then what? Ninkei looked at his senior brother's back and shouted in confusion. The eldest brother said in. Eldest to know to brother said. I know. Eldest to catch to Ning to uncle. Ning. Academy, eldest academy to say. Ning Emperor Academy to Ning to eldest academy to Sure Quebec Ning in academy in by academy. Ninkei chased up and asked angrily, Senior brother, did you hear that? What are the rules of the academy? The eldest brother sighed and said, the back cliff was used by the headmaster to imprison youngest uncle. You haven't caused as much trouble as he did. You're not guilty enough, so you're not qualified to be imprisoned there. Ninkei was stunned and asked, then what should we do? Eldest brother looked at him and said seriously, wait for the headmaster to come back. Ninkei asked, what if the headmaster never comes back? Eldest brother patted him on the shoulder and said, then we will pretend that we don't know, okay? At this time the two of them had already walked to the wooden door, and walked past the stone that was deeply rooted in the mountain. Ninkei seriously thought for a long time, but still could not understand what eldest brother's attitude was. He could not understand why eldest brother did not react as he expected to such an important matter. The wooden door that could block cultivators below the see-through realm opened without any wind in front of the two people. Eldest brother took out a silk handkerchief and slowly wiped a small bronze mirror clean. Then he put it back into his sleeve. I heard that you went to the House of Red Sleeves to see Aunt Jian yesterday. Yes. She is also a woman with a hard life. Ninkei saw the small bronze mirror, but he did not know what eldest brother had done with it. The two finally reached the highest peak of the back mountain of the academy. Ninkei stood on the edge of the cliff and looked at the sea of clouds under his feet. He felt the cold wind blowing on his face and recalled the scenery of that night. He could not help but feel slightly shaken. Eldest brother stood beside him and looked at the sea of clouds and the winter sun. He said slowly, the trip to the wilderness is a trial. You performed well and can officially represent the academy to enter the human realm. I think you'd better be mentally prepared. This was the third time Ninkei heard about entering the human realm in the past 2 days. He looked at eldest brother uneasily. Although he did not understand what entering the human realm meant, he vaguely felt that it was a very troublesome thing. Senior brother, what is entering the human realm? Entering the human realm means returning to the human realm. Ninkei asked confusedly. Cultivators go through a lot of hardships to be born into the human realm. Why do they enter the human realm? Eldest brother smiled and said, because cultivators also need to eat. This reason was very strong because there was nothing more important than eating in this world. However, Ninkei still could not understand the logic behind it. With the ability of cultivators, how could they not be able to make a living? Moreover, what did cultivators need to eat have anything to do with the academy? What did it have to do with the academy entering the human realm? Eldest brother looked at the sea of clouds beneath his feet and said, cultivation is a very extravagant thing. Regardless of whether it is the creation of natal items or other things, they all require a lot of resources. Take your primordial 13 arrows as an example. The bow and arrows need special iron and refined steel, which requires extremely precious ores. Why didn't anyone in the cultivation world create similar bows and arrows in the past? On one hand, it is because they lack the wonderful ideas in your mind and the admirable practical spirit of fourth brother and sixth brother. More importantly, they are not like our academy, which has the minds of the entire Tang Empire for us to use. You have to know that your bow and arrows can only be made a few times. Ninkei knew that the materials needed to make the primordial 13 arrows were very special and rare. However, when the bow and arrows were made, it was fourth brother and sixth brother who were responsible for the specific planning. He did not know that such a bow and arrows needed the resources of the entire Tang Empire. He could not help but be stunned. He suddenly asked, "Are the other unknown places also entering the human realm? I think Tang and Yisu seem to be wandering in the human realm, and have nothing to do with the human realm." The Xiankong Temple is supported by many Buddhist temples. The Jishou Abbey has the West Hill Divine Palace in the human realm. The West Hill Divine Palace is supported by the believers of the world. Most of the world's resources are in the hands of Haotian Taoism, and there is only one academy in the world. This academy is in the southern suburbs of Chang, and on the land under our feet. It can continue to exist because it is supported by the entire Tang Empire. It is said that the academy is the only holy land that connects the two worlds. In fact, apart from the fact that the headmaster likes to be close to the human realm, the most important reason is that we can only survive if we appear in the human realm. A gust of strong wind blew through the mountains, blowing away the drifting clouds in front of the cliff, revealing the fertile farmland covered in snow below. Indistinctly, the outlines of a few villages could be seen. It was indeed a beautiful world. Eldest brother pointed to that place and said with emotion, "Look at the great rivers and mountains. We cultivators don't produce, but we consume things that ordinary people can't imagine in a lifetime. In fact, we are supported by the most ordinary farmers and miners in these villages, so we should do something for them." Ning Ke looked at the distant human realm below the cliff and asked absent-mindedly, "Then what should we do for them?" "Don't worry, younger brother. The so-called entry into the human realm is just to maintain the connection between the academy and the human realm. It is not a very troublesome thing. You just need to remember that we have to protect the order and peace of the Tang Empire, so we have to remember the principle that the law of the Tang Empire comes first. Then we have to represent the Tang Empire and the Academy in the process of this world. You have already taken the first step in the wilderness. Then, when someone comes to challenge you, you need to protect the dignity of the Tang Empire and the Academy." "How?" "To put it simply, you have to defeat everyone who dares to challenge you." Ning Ke was shocked and said, "So simple and violent?" Eldest brother said, "The Tao addict has returned to the West Hill. She told people that you are the person with the most similar cultivation philosophy to her. As far as I know, the little girl has always believed that the purpose of cultivation is to fight. Younger brother, do you also think so?" After thinking about it, Ning Ke was sure that Yi Hongyu was right. He was that kind of person. Eldest brother said, "Then isn't fighting the most simple and violent thing in the world?" Ning Ke looked at the gradually closing cloud eyebrows in front of the cliff and frowned. He said, "I always feel that something is wrong. Do I have to fight with anyone who comes to challenge me?" Eldest brother sighed and said, "It is indeed not appropriate. Unfortunately, the academy is very different from the Jishou Abbey and the Xiankong Temple. No one knows where the Jishou Abbey and the Xiankong Temple are, but all the cultivators in the world know where the academy is. Therefore, we can't travel around the world freely like Yisu and Tang. We can only wait here passively." "Wait a minute. Why do I feel that something is wrong?" Ning Ke said, "Eldest brother, you always play outside with the headmaster. I have never seen anyone enter the back of the mountain. Then where did those who wanted to challenge the academy go?" Eldest brother explained seriously, "They were all killed by youngest uncle." Ning Ke was stunned for a long time. He asked, "What about the years after youngest uncle?" "Youngest uncle's prestige is still there. And each generation is the previous generation." "Do you mean that I am the youngest uncle of this generation? Because you have inherited youngest uncle's mantle." Ning Ke shook his head and asked with some uncertainty, "Do you mean that the so-called people who enter the human realm are the thugs that the academy uses to keep the peace? If anyone dares to cause trouble in Chang, and I have to kill him?" "Younger brother, you can understand it this way. But thug is a little inappropriate. It is probably similar to the front gate protector of the Buddhism sect that Lotus used to be. You have to know that it is really an enviable thing to inherit youngest uncle's mantle." After a moment of silence, Ning Ke said seriously, "Bluff? Eldest brother, continue bluffing." Sob sob sob. "Thank you very much for your votes. I can't repay you. Then I will write another chapter, sob sob sob. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 346. Eldest brother did not understand what Ning Ke meant, but Ning Ke had been fooled by him to the point of bitterness and sorrow, which had condensed into malice. He wished he could steal the cudgel on second brother's head and knock him out to vent his anger. He thought to himself, you and the headmaster of the academy are sightseeing outside every day, while the others in the back mountain are playing the zither, playing the flute, enjoying the flowers and playing chess. They are living such a happy life, but you throw me, the youngest disciple, into the outside world to suffer in the bitter wind and rain. What's the reason for this? Now that he thought about it, the academy changed the real world to the wilderness, and he had to enter the front gate of the devil's doctrine to inherit the mantle of youngest uncle. Ning Ke shouted with grief and indignation. This is a trap. Eldest brother said with a smile, what do you mean by that? Ning Ke said angrily, why can't other senior brothers and sisters do? Why do I have to be the one to enter the human realm? Eldest brother sighed and said sincerely, you know Beigong and the others. They spend all day in the mountains and forests, obsessed with the zither, chess, calligraphy and painting, smithing and talisman Taoism. They know nothing about the world and are as naive as children. It's not suitable for them to enter the human realm, unless you want them to be beaten badly and come back crying in less than 2 days. What about second brother? He's so strong. Junemo, he seems to abide by the ancient etiquette and is very upright, but he's too much of a gentleman. He doesn't know how to deal with the situation and is easily forced to the point of no return. His character is a little bit. At this point, eldest brother paused for a while and then said with a bitter smile, he's a little stupid, and he admires youngest uncle too much. If he really enters the human realm, he might really set off a bloody storm in Chong. And Ning Ke asked again, what about Chen Pipi? He's the youngest in the knowing destiny state. If he were to be paraded on the street, he would immediately frighten all the guys who dare to challenge the academy. There's no need to do anything. He's much more suitable than me. 12th brother's background is a little special, so it's not suitable for him to represent the academy. Eldest brother looked at Ning Ke and said, youngest brother, you're different. You have the strongest aura of the human world, so you can't be at ease in the mountain like us. So you're the most suitable for entering the human realm. This is also the lucky chance I told you in the wilderness. Don't talk about those useless things. Ning Ke said angrily, senior brother has said so much and I finally understand the main point. But you mean that I have seen too many deaths in my life and have rich fighting experience. My heart has been soaked in dirty water for many years. I am not as naive as other senior brothers and sisters. Instead, I am very insidious. And I am not as honest as second brother. I am slippery and shameless. Most importantly, I am not as special as Chun Pipi and have a good backer. Although this is the truth, I really don't think so. Moreover, this matter is really not as troublesome as you think. Eldest brother said honestly, but he did not know that his honesty had hurt Ning Ke a second time. Junior martial uncle has also walked this path before. Back then he rode that little black donkey into Chong and city and defeated 37 powerful cultivators in the world. He caused a lot of trouble. Who has he been afraid of? Ning Ke was not inspired by these words at all. Compared with the legendary junior martial uncle who had single-handedly destroyed the devil's doctrine, he felt that he was not even a hair. How could he have the confidence to cause trouble? He suddenly thought of an idea and asked, if the enemy is too strong, will the academy help me? Eldest brother said seriously, if the enemy challenges you face to face and challenges you to a duel, the academy can't afford to lose face. Ning Ke said in shock, do I have to fight with the Sage of Sword Lu Bai if he comes? Eldest brother comforted him and said, he can't afford to lose face. I think the people who will come to Chong and city to challenge you in the next few years should be some young people. But there are hidden dragons and crouching tigers in the cultivation sections. Junior brother, although you have made rapid progress, you entered Taoism late and your state is still a little low. so you need to be careful. Senior brother, you know that my state is low but you still say so. How can I bear it? The state goes from low to high. Don't worry. Why do those people in the wilderness who heard that I was a disciple of the second floor of the academy were scared like quails and did not dare to challenge me? But now that I have entered the human realm, they dare to challenge me? Because that is the wilderness, not Chang'an. You can choose not to accept their challenge in the wilderness, and even their challenge to you can be seen as a provocation to the academy. But in Chang'an you have to accept their challenge, because this challenge is no longer a provocation to the academy, but an opportunity to show the courage and glory of cultivators. Why? Because you are a Tang and a student of the academy. Ning Ke found it hard to adapt to these unreasonable, but vaguely magnificent unspoken rules. After thinking for a long time, he asked confusedly, I have defeated Long Qing. Are there still people who don't know what's good for them to challenge me? Eldest brother said, but no one believes that you defeated Long Qing with your own strength. And Yi Hongyu's evaluation of you after returning to West Hill did not seem to be very high. Ning Ke said blankly, after all, Yi Hongyu is an acquaintance. Why should I tell the truth? Then he began to think about how he should deal with a powerful cultivator like the Tao addict who came to Chang and invited him to a duel. Or in other words, how should he admit defeat in a more elegant manner? At this moment, eldest brother reminded him seriously, anyway, you can't lose because the headmaster can't afford to lose. Ning Ke lost all his respect for eldest brother after hearing that he couldn't afford to lose 3 times in a row. He said bitterly, Senior brother, you seem to have forgotten the most important thing. The problem I mentioned to you by the wooden door just now has not been solved. What if others find out that I have joined the devil? Does the academy have to admit that we have taken in the remnants of the devil's doctrine? This is indeed a problem. Although it is not a big deal to be accused of taking in the remnants of the devil's doctrine, it is still troublesome. We have to think of some ways to cover it up. Eldest brother thought for a moment and said, then you don't have to use youngest uncle's great spirit. Ning Ke had thought that he could come up with a wonderful idea, but he did not expect such an answer. He could not help but think of the scene of eldest brother apologizing for being late behind the front gate of the devil's doctrine. He thought bitterly that eldest brother was indeed an irresponsible guy. After the conversation with eldest brother, Ning Ke found second brother and complained about his troubles, hoping to get some sympathy or military support. Unexpectedly, second brother not only did not sympathize with him, but sternly said that this was a rare opportunity for cultivation. He even sighed with emotion at the end that if he had not been famous in the world, no one would dare to challenge him, and there would be no enemy worthy of his attack. He wished he could replace Ning Ke to enter the human realm. Hearing second brother's words, Ning Ke finally understood that the so-called entering the human realm was not the academy throwing him out to be a watchdog to keep quiet, but it was also a kind of cultivation. However, what he was best at in his life was hunting in the forest and chopping off heads at night, so he was somewhat resistant to this kind of cultivation. No matter how resistant he was, he had to accept his fate. So he began to seriously think about how to face the battle invitations that might come at any time in the next few years. According to his previous temperament, he could not admit defeat casually because he might be beaten into ashes by the headmaster of academy. According to his previous temperament, if he met a strong enemy, he would secretly use some insidious means to cut off the enemy's head at night, but he would be beaten into a pulp by second brother. So he found that he really needed help. Sang Sang was naturally the most suitable candidate, but he thought that the process of fighting with those powerful cultivators might be a little dangerous, so he did not want to drag her into it. He also thought that if Spring Breeze Pavilion Old Chow was still in Chang, then he would really have nothing to fear. With their strength and tacit understanding in battle, even a great divine priest from the West Hill Divine Palace might have a chance to become famous, let alone the Tao addict. It was a pity that Chao Xiaoshu was not here. Fortunately, at least in the recent days, Mo Shanshan was in Chang and Ning Ke wanted to be a good host. So in the following days, he would go to the residence of the Black Ink Garden disciples every day after leaving the old brush pen shop and take Mo Shanshan to sightsee. Sometimes he would take Catgirl to a famous restaurant to have a big meal. Thinking that the two had developed a tacit understanding in the wilderness, Ning Ke did not explain too much to the calligraphy addict. However, no explanation often led to problems. In the eyes of those girls from the Great River Kingdom, Mr. 13 of the Academy, who would come to report on time every day, obviously had a different feeling for the Hill Master. Sometimes it was cloudy and snowy in Chang'an, and sometimes it was sunny in winter. Ning Ke and Imo Shanshan traveled side by side. Sometimes they held the same umbrella, and sometimes they looked at the same fish by the moat. When they passed the Spring Breeze Pavilion, he told her the story of the murder on that rainy night. When they climbed the Wanyan Tower, he said that there were many stone statues behind it to see. Sometimes they talked about books and talisman Taoism. Time passed slowly and peacefully. Just like this for a few days, Ning Ke did not meet any big man jumping out of the street, nor did he see a Taoist sword flying toward him. The so-called challenge of entering the human realm had no trace at all. He thought that this was right. With the Academy's reputation, which cultivator would be so bored to come and challenge him? He no longer worried about this matter. That day, eldest brother made him vaguely understand the Academy's attitude toward joining the devil. With a beautiful female talisman master accompanying him, he could not help but be in a good mood. He thought that the Academy's title of entering the human realm was quite magnanimous. According to what eldest brother said, the Academy had the responsibility to help the Tang Empire advance in an orderly manner. Didn't that mean that after a few years, he could also express his opinion on who would be the Tang Empire's emperor? Thinking of these things, he could not help but feel proud. On a day when the winter snow was gradually melting, Ning Ke held the big black umbrella and waited outside the Ministry of Rites. He and Imo Shanshan had made an appointment to go to the Forest of Steels to see the calligraphy of the predecessors. However, not long after Imo Shanshan walked out of the Ministry of Rites, a young monk in a thin frock also followed the two of them. He put his palms together and asked politely, "May I ask if you are Mr. 13 of the Academy?" My bad brain made a mistake. It's about the relationship between the Academy and the military. But in fact this mistake happened before, not today. Hua Shangyue should not have studied in the Academy. Because earlier, when Liu talked about Ning Ke's future, I had already confirmed that after graduating from the Academy, he could not join the military. But later I forgot about it, so I made more mistakes. There are many things in the outline, including Elon. So I can only change the rule that after graduating from the Academy, and I will change it when I am free. Sorry. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 347. The young monk was about 25 or 26 years old. He was handsome and kind, with a slightly dark complexion. His thin robes fluttered in the wind, making him look otherworldly. However, it was still winter, and no one knew why he was not afraid of the cold. Ning Ke felt a little wary, but he did not show it on his face. He smiled and asked, "Master, do you know me?" The monk smiled and said, "This poor monk guessed." Ning Ke asked in surprise, "You guessed it?" The monk said calmly, "Because I have seen the calligraphy addict, so I guessed that you are Mr. 13. Ning Ke thought of the rumor that had been spreading recently and could not help but laugh bitterly. Imo Shanshan looked at the young monk, and her eyes gradually focused. She thought of the scene when they met years ago, and said with slight surprise, "So it's senior brother Guan Hai. How have you been? Why are you in Chang'an?" Through her introduction, Ning Ke found out that the young monk was Guan Hai, the last disciple of the Lang Temple elder. His expression suddenly became a little strange. This world was different from the one Ning Ke had lived in. Not every housewife was a master of both Buddhism and Taoism. Compared with Haotian Taoism, the influence of the Buddhism sect was much smaller, and the Dharma was not prosperous. However, the Lang Temple was too famous, especially to ordinary people. No one knew about the Xiankong Temple, but they all knew about the Lang Temple. To cultivators, the Lang Temple had a higher status than the White Tower Temple of the Yueluan Kingdom. Even Ning Ke, who did not know anything about the Buddhism sect, had heard of the Lang Temple and had a deep impression of it. Too many stories had happened in the 1,000-year-old temple. Master Lotus had become famous because of his debate with the Lang Temple elder. Later, he had secluded himself in the temple for several years. The bloody case of the destruction of the devil's doctrine, which had completely changed the face of the cultivation world, had also started in front of the Lang Temple. Ning Ke had first heard of the Lang Temple when Prince Longqing first entered Chang'an. Longqing had also become famous because of his debate in the Lang Temple. Thinking of this, he could not help but wonder if cultivators in the world who wanted to become famous had to go through the Lang Temple and participate in the debate organized by the Lang Temple. Because of these stories, the Lang Temple had a special status in the cultivation world. The elder who lived in seclusion in the back of the mountain was even more senior. Since the young monk in front of the umbrella was a disciple of the elder of the Lang Temple, he should have a higher status than the legendary 7 disciples of the Buddhism sect. According to Ning Ke's character, he should have gotten closer to this young monk called Guan Hai. However, he had been wary of other sects coming to challenge him because of the so-called academy's entry into the human realm. Now that he suddenly saw someone from the Lang Temple appear in Chang'an, he could not help but feel uneasy. So it's the Vedanta of the Lang Temple. I don't know why I didn't see you in the palace, he said with a smile. The young monk said that he did not dare and said respectfully, I don't dare to call myself Vedanta. Moreover, my master bowed to the headmaster of the academy as a disciple. How can Lin Hai bear the title of senior brother, Mr. 13? As for the matter in the wilderness, the temple has also received an edict from the Divine Hall. However, the disciples of the Buddhism sect pay attention to cultivation and do not get involved in the mortal world, so we did not go. Hearing these words, Ning Ke thought to himself that the monk would not covet fame if he did not mess with the mortal world, so he probably would not make trouble for him. Ning Ke felt a little relieved, and when he saw the admiration in the monk's clear eyes, he felt very comfortable. He asked gently, Senior brother, what business do you have in Chang'an? No matter if it was a sedan chair or a bamboo sedan chair, it always needed 2 people to carry it. That was why Lin Hai did not dare to admit that he was the senior brother. However, Ning Ke insisted on calling him that. From this, eldest brother was right. He was indeed the best candidate for the back mountain of the academy. Lin Hai took out an envelope wrapped in yellow cloth and said, I changed my documents at the Ministry of Rights and was about to leave the city to go to the academy. I did not expect to meet Mr. 13, so I can send this invitation to you and slack off. An invitation to the academy? Ning Ke opened the yellow cloth and found that the envelope was not sealed. He took out a very thin piece of paper. The content of the paper was simple and clear. It was an invitation from the Lang Temple elder to the academy to send someone to attend the Yulan Hungry Ghost Festival next year. After the conversation with eldest brother, he was very clear that if the academy had any secular affairs in the future, they would be handled by him. Then he would definitely attend the Yulan Hungry Ghost Festival in the Lang Temple. Fortunately, there was still more than a year's time so he could prepare well. Moreover, he could confirm that the person from the Lang Temple was here to send an invitation, so he could not help but feel more at ease. He looked at Guan Hai and said with a smile, Senior brother, you have come from the Lang Temple, so you should be a good host. However, I have made an appointment with the Hill Master to travel together. I will drink tea and chat with Senior brother at night. Is that okay? Monk Guan Hai replied respectfully, Mr. 13, you are too polite. I have come to Chang, and under the orders of my master and have already slowed down my studies. Since I have already sent the invitation to you today, I will return to the temple later. Let's go, let's go. I have to return home, Ning Ke thought happily. However, on the surface, he was extremely enthusiastic and tried to persuade him to stay. He even put on a fake angry look that was unique to men from Hebei County. Monk Guan Hai refused repeatedly and said, I really cannot delay my studies any longer. It is just that it is rare for me to come to Chang'an and meet Mr. 13 in person. I have some problems in cultivation and hope that Mr. 13 can give me some advice. No problem at all. Speaking of which, I will book a table of vegetarian noodles at the Building of Pines and Cranes in the evening, along with 2 jars of vegetarian wine. You and I can drink and chat or even have tea. We can discuss it in detail then. And what did you say just now? Ning-Ke spoke in high spirits and fully acted like a person from the academy who had entered the human realm. It was only then that he came to his senses. There were many things in the world that did not need to be said clearly and could not be said clearly, because if it was said too clearly, it would make both parties feel embarrassed. People who came from places like the academy, the West Hill Divine Palace or the Lank Temple usually had to pay attention to their demeanor. Since they were cultivators who had not entered the human realm, how could they act like hooligans in the secular world who would pick up a watermelon knife and slash at the other party's chest or bald head without saying anything or saying a few harsh words? Even if they wanted to fight, they had to find prettier clothes and a better reason for it. People like Ning-Ke and Yi Hongyu, who fought as they pleased and never cared about their demeanor and only wanted to win, were rare in the cultivation world. As for the prettier clothes and the better reason, it was nothing more than to ask for advice on the problems in cultivation, and to discuss the state of cultivation with each other. Without all these external appearances, the naked truth was to ask for a fight. After confirming that the monk from the Lank Temple had issued an invitation for a fight, Ning-Ke's expression changed slightly. Looking at the monk's slightly dark cheeks, he could not help but think of Sang-Sang and Zhuo-Er's skin color. He thought to himself that he seemed to be going against people with skin color like that for the rest of his life. After a moment, he said sincerely, "A monk is merciful. Why do you care about the superficial reputation?" Monk Guanhai said with more sincerity, "I have been cultivating in the temple for many years, and I have often heard the elders talk about the past of seeking guidance from the headmaster. I know that the academy is a first-class place in the world, and I have always yearned to visit the academy. However, I have always been tied down by my schoolwork. It is rare for me to come to Chong and City today, and I hope Mr. 13 can understand my rare greed and give me some advice." Ning-Ke stared into his eyes and found that there was nothing but respect and admiration in the young monk's eyes. There was nothing but a firm will to fight. The other party was so respectful and admiring. How could you scold him? The other party had such a firm will to fight, and he was a stubborn monk who never ate oil and rarely ate salt. How could you persuade him? Ning-Ke did not know how to deal with the situation in front of him. If it had been in the city of Wei, he could have run away. However, he was forced to carry the 2 mountains of the Tang Empire and the academy on his back. If he really ran, it would be difficult. In fact, he had never been afraid of fighting, let alone fighting. He was just worried that he could not win. Guanhai was the last disciple of the Lank Temple elder. In Ning-Ke's opinion, the last disciple of the master of calligrapher, Mo Shanshan, and himself, the last disciple of the headmaster of academy. Well, he had to admit that he was the weakest wayfarer of the academy in history. Therefore, he had less and less confidence in defeating the other party. Sometimes it could be called courage, but sometimes it could be called stupidity. Ning-Ke held the big black umbrella and fell into a long silence in the light snow of Chong, and he struggled between bravery and wisdom, but he could not come up with an answer. Mo Shanshan had been standing quietly by the big black umbrella. She could probably guess the pain in his heart. She could not help but look down and blink her eyelashes. It took a lot of effort to not let a smile appear on her face. Monk Guanhai was an honest man. Ever since he was young, he had always heard the elders' respect and admiration for the headmaster of academy. He had never thought that he could defeat a student of the 2nd floor of the academy. Now, seeing that Ning-Ke was silent for a long time, he thought that Mr. 13 probably did not want him to lose too badly. He could not help but feel touched. "Mr. 13, if you think that my cultivation is low, why don't we sit down and meditate?" he said sincerely. Ning-Ke thought to himself that the Lank Temple was famous for debating. Besides, the monk's skin was slightly dark and his name was Guanhai. It was obvious that he ate a lot of soybean oil and was good at arguing with others. If he were to sit down and meditate with him, wouldn't he be defeated in less than 3 breaths and officially announce his defeat in the first battle after entering the human realm? Losing was not a problem. The problem was that eldest brother would not let him lose. The problem was that it would bring shame to the academy and the headmaster of academy. The headmaster of academy did not seem to be able to afford to lose, so this would lead to a series of very serious problems. Ninkei raised his head and met the monk's clear and sincere eyes. His heart skipped a beat, and he suddenly felt that he lacked something very important compared to the monk. The falling snowflakes covered the greasy surface of the big black umbrella. Ninkei looked at the monk and said calmly, "Senior brother, can I trouble you to wait for me for half a day?" Monk Guanhai put his palms together. Emo Shanshan looked at him and asked, "What do you need half a day for?" "I need half a day to think about a very important problem." After saying this, Ninkei closed the big black umbrella and carried it on his back. He walked toward the south of Chang, and in the light snow. An hour later, he came to the newly dredged lake in the south of the city and slowly sat down in the snow. My inability to compose sentences suddenly flared up. It's very painful to write and I don't know how to write. But today is the last day and I can't drop the ball. I will continue to struggle like Ninkei and I will win. The next chapter may be later, but if it goes well, it won't be too late. Thank you. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com and vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. You're tuning in to the Li Mei Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.